I met Will when we were both sophomores in college. We went from being fast friends to best friends to dating over the next year, and by the time we graduated, we'd already decided we were getting married and moving to the Midwest. And for a few years, we were so happy. Not that we ever struggled, but when I got terribly sick for a few weeks, he took care of me. When he lost his job, I kept his spirits up until he found a new one. Overall, it felt like we were incredibly lucky, and I was going through life with a person I knew and loved the most in the world. It was 3 years ago when things started to change. I blame some of it on the miscarriage. We decided it was time to try for kids, and we were both excited when I got pregnant. But just a couple of months later, I was getting sick again like before. The doctors had never pinned down the exact cause of my illness, and while this time it lasted less than a week, it was during that time I lost the baby. We were both hurt by it, but I think Will took it harder. He seemed haunted after that, more anxious and prone to strange compulsions, like throwing out perfectly good food and drinks from time to time and checking my car before I took any long trip. It was as though he was terrified I was going to get sick again or somehow have an accident. It was sweet in a way, but also bizarre. And anytime I talked about us trying to have a baby again, he just looked stricken and changed the subject. After some time, I decided to let it go, thinking that eventually things would get better. Instead, I found his suicide note. I call it that because even though it is long and styled like a journal entry, the tone and purpose of it is pretty clear. It's a confession, or maybe more of a concession, a surrender to some terrible inevitability that Will seems to think has been crawling toward him for most of his life, a life that he clearly means to end. But when I started reading this spiral-bound notebook that had fallen out from between two dusty boxes in our rarely used attic, I didn't realize all of that yet. Because, as with most endings, Will's story began far away. It read, "Something else sees through my eyes. I know how that sounds. Crazy. Which is why I never told anyone this. Not even you. Writing this now. Will you ever find it or read it? I don't know. I may destroy it before I'm even done. Is it worth you understanding a bit more if you don't believe? Or you believing me if it doesn't stop you from hating me? I don't have answers to any of that, and I've spent years trying to find a way to understand. I feel like a toad in a dried up pond, just cooking in the noon sun and not really understanding why any of it's happening. I know things used to be good, and I know I'm burning up, drying out, becoming less of myself, and so tired of being afraid all the time. But I'm not doing a good job of explaining this, which is supposed to be the point. So I'll start over. When I was 7 years old, something stung me. I'd been playing out with friends in the woods near my house when it happened, and it hurt so bad that it dropped me to my knees. I never saw what it was or where it went, but by the time my friends got me back to the house, there was a knot on the back of my neck the size of an egg. I spent 2 days in the hospital, but when I got out, I felt better. No side effects, no scar or ongoing pain. Just an EpiPen in case I ever got stung again, and a strict rule from my parents to never go in the woods again. In fact, over the next year, I mostly forgot about the incident. until one night, I woke up to realize I wasn't in bed. I was standing by my open bedroom window, looking out into the night, and I could feel something moving in my head, seeing through my eyes. Like I said before, it's a crazy idea, easy for me to dismiss as my imagination or me having a nightmare, and it wasn't like I started having lots of odd behavior or blackouts. I didn't, so far as I could tell, have any outward signs of anything touching me or invading me at all, unless you wanted to count that one bout of light sleepwalking. Yet despite that, the feeling that something was there didn't go away. By the time I was 10, I talked to myself regularly, having become so used to the idea that I treated it like a secret friend, be it God, a guardian angel, or a wood fairy that only I could sense. I need to stress that for the most part, none of this was scary, even though I knew it was real. It was strangely comforting, both because it gave me someone to share things with, and because it made me feel special, chosen. But it's important that you know that I wasn't afraid of it, because if I had been, I would never let myself get close to you, or our baby. When I met you, well, I felt like my whole world changed. I think I knew I loved you from that first night at the party, and that feeling has only gotten stronger ever since. The idea of having a life with you, starting a family, well, if there's something better than that, I don't know what it would be. And yes, I thought about telling you about my companion 100 times over the years, but even when I knew you wouldn't leave me, I was afraid you'd think I was crazy, that you'd see me differently somehow, as lesser than I'd been before, and the idea of that terrified me. So I kept quiet and just counted my blessings that I had 2 wonderful friends in my life. When you got sick the first time, I've never been so scared. All the tests, the trips to the specialists, and then having to spend 3 weeks in the hospital before you got well, I really thought I might lose you. I didn't understand what was going on at the time, of course, and so, when you finally come home, I was out of my mind happy. It wasn't until you got sick again, when we lost the baby, that I realized I was to blame. I woke up one night. This was after you were already starting to vomit and run a fever, but before we carried you to the hospital. I woke up one night to find myself standing in the kitchen next to the open refrigerator. I was pouring something, a thick, whitish line of slime, from my palm into the mouth of the milk jug. I stopped, panicked and confused, looking around for some explanation of what I was doing and where the foul-smelling stuff coating my hand had come from. That's when I noticed the bitter taste in the back of my throat, chest too tight to breathe. I reached into my mouth to the point of gagging, finger trembling as it touched the small, hard point in the back of my throat. I ran to the sink then and vomited out more of the white fluid before making my way to the bathroom mirror. Something was moving back there in the shadows of my interior. Shining a light against the mirror, I focused the beam into a small point of black bone, jutting out of the greyish-pink flesh around it like a tiny fang or small stinger, oozing more of that milky corruption with each twitching shudder. It was then that I knew I had to die. I didn't do it right away, of course. Even when we lost the baby later in the week, I made excuses. I was terrified of the consequences of ending it, and there were days where I'd convince myself the whole thing was in my head. I'd feel nothing behind my eyes and see nothing when I looked inside. I'd tell myself I was crazy and needed help, or I was weak and needed to get over my strange nightmares and delusions. Anything to stay alive and be with you. But the signs would always return. I know it seems strange to you, but I've taken to guarding your food, putting in a dozen ways for me to check for tampering with something you might eat or drink when I'm not in control. I know I've kept you from getting sick at times, but it won't last forever. Whatever this thing is, I know it's smarter and stronger than me. And more, I can tell it's taking control. So I have to stop it by ending me, now before it's too late. I will go out into the woods tomorrow and end it before I hurt you worse than I already have. I will always love you, and if you ever read this, please know that I never stop trying to find a better way. But it's crawling up the front of my mind, and I can't let it touch you. So, goodbye. May 14th, 2023. Will. I stuff the journal under a pillow as I hear footsteps coming down the hall. Wiping my eyes, I look up to see Will standing there staring at me. What are you doing? His voice is cool and detached, like it has been a lot of the time in the last few weeks. I'd taken it as a sign of things maybe getting better, that he was being more cold and aloof as part of getting his anxiety and depression under control, and that when he came out to the other side, he'd be his old self again. Now, I felt a chill as he watched me watch him. Nothing, just reading stuff. His expression didn't change. What stuff? You look like you've been crying. I shrugged and forced a laugh. Just stuff on your phone. You know, girl stuff. Sappy stuff to make you cry. I'm okay. Not the note that Will wrote over a month ago, right before he started acting like you. He nodded and made a sound deep in his throat. Good. Well, come on then. It's dinner time. I've made you something special. I gave him a smile. Sounds great. I'll be there. Just need to get something first. Every Christmas, my family booby-trapped the chimney. I never knew why until one year. We finally caught something coming down. That year, my trap did not work. They never worked. The week before Christmas, we'd gone shopping as a family. First to a craft store for the kids, and then a hardware store for the grown-ups. Walking the colourful aisles, Mariah Carey in the background, I had excitedly bought a pack of orange HB pencils, flat on either end. They made me think of the scaffolding the builders had put up around school one year, full of endless possibilities. Along with the pencils, I bought a bag of rubber bands to bind them together. In my imagination, I conceived of a truly fantastic catapult that would pelt the invaders with marbles and thumbtacks. Come Christmas Eve, my sister and I sat at one table and went to work, making our own traps with the materials we had selected. I had my pencils, and my sister, a few years younger than me, was busy making something out of pipe cleaners and Play-Doh. I remember scoffing out of work and thinking whatever she had in mind wouldn't even work. On a table beside us, our mother made her own traps, I always remember thinking that the grown-ups put no real imagination into their creations, but every year the sight of them would turn my stomach nonetheless. Mum liked broken light bulbs hung on ropes, and this year she prepared another 5 or 6 to be nailed on the inside of the chimney. She also fashioned some heavy wooden planks with dozens of rusty nails and bent, jagged knives driven into them. She always made the same things, and would stand at her table every year furiously sawing or hammering with sweat pouring down her forehead. Dad did his work in the garage. He had a welder's torch in there, and something called a lathe, and all sorts of other interesting tools. His traps were almost always made of rusted metal and razor-sharp edges, creaking hinges and quivering springs that made even my childish fingers wary. When he finally emerged from his workshop this year, he revealed a funny-looking contraption that looked to me like some kind of cannon with a large air canister attached, the sort of thing I'd seen on a diver's back. When a pressure plate was triggered, a sharp-looking metal spear came shooting 3 feet out of the barrel in a heart-stopping explosion. Dad grinned with pride when we all jumped back during the test fire. Then he spent 30 minutes swearing angrily as he tried to reload the spike. After that, he set about hiding it in the fireplace. This involved digging a hole, and there was a brief moment as he knelt there, covered in soot, where he reached his hand out toward me and called me Alex, asking me to grab the gas canister and bring it over. Before I could even try and do what he asked, Mum intervened and did it instead. Of course, she could not pick it up, so she had to sort of roll walk it over. Dad was quiet the entire time. That happened whenever someone mentioned my older brother. People went quiet. He could have picked up the gas canister easily. He had always been big, even bigger than Dad. He took after Grandpa, who was a giant at 5'6". In later years, my PE teacher would lament I never got those genes. My sister and I both took after our father, who, while big, was no giant. After all this was done, after the loose rock and the ash was put back in place, after the pressure plate and the tripwires were hidden or disguised as standard Christmas decorations, after the bear traps were draped with old clothes or empty boxes, and Mum's knife-covered planks were placed beneath meticulously crafted false floors, my sister and I gave Mum and Dad our traps, and they were placed carefully in the middle of the ambush. I loved this moment. I don't know why. I think, looking back, it was the feeling of being a unit, a family. We helped. I was still scared of the dark, and my sister had barely mastered the toilet, but we were helping. And good God, ever since Alex had gone, I'd wanted to help so bad. The shape of my older brother was a vague one. I loved him, but I didn't really know him. Couldn't have, given my age. Instead, I grew up in a world where Mum and Dad cried a lot and fought even more, and sometimes they themselves would admit they fought over nothing at all. They fought because it hurt. Because even after my sister had been born, they still couldn't bring themselves to touch Alex's room, or to even really acknowledge that it existed without it causing a painful, sullen silence. So, for that brief moment where we stood surveying the fireplace in the living room, it felt like our version of the perfect, happy family. After that, it was bedtime for my sister and I. We liked our special Christmas beds. I liked that they were cozy and special, and that Mum would put the telly on and turn the volume all the way up and no one cared if we ate too much candy or even watched films we weren't allowed to watch. So long as we stayed in the basement, it was fine. We had all these blankets and pillows so we could make forts, and no one came down to check if we were asleep at a good time. Despite all the excitement though, we usually never made it past midnight. There was only so much our little bodies could handle. Mum and Dad though, they stayed up. I thought that was normal. You don't know how much your parents sacrificed until you become one yourself. Never appreciated what it meant for my dad, mid-40s by this point, to stand upright and stay awake all night, or for my mum to do the same. The two of them, all night, shaking each other awake when the other one started to flag. That was the year I lost the privilege of ignorance. Isn't it funny how the best and worst moments of your life often overlap? Maybe it's just a light bulb effect, I don't know. That night, my sister and I went down to the basement, climbed into our blanket fort, and watched the never-ending story. She fell asleep 10 minutes in. I stayed up and watched every second of it. I can still see all that in my mind as clear as day. Feels like one of the happiest and purest moments of my life. Falling asleep on the credits, gently dreaming of what it might be like to have my own dragon to fly over school. I think that was it. The last time I was just a child. I think most of us have memories like that, don't we? The moment in time when we stopped being kids. Next thing I remember, I was coming to, bathed in a cold grey light. Eyes heavy, head woozy. Something was wrong and I could feel it. It was quiet, cold with the draft, and my sister was nowhere to be seen. It took me a moment to realise that the lights were off, along with the TV, and I was seeing the basement only by the glow of the upstairs hallway. That was unusual. Mum and Dad always locked the basement door and barred it from the other side. Tonight, it was wide open, and something about the world up there seemed sinister to my childish eyes. I don't know how to describe it exactly. I'd woken up and something was wrong. I sat upright and slinked out of bed in the hope that any moment I'd see a better, happier world coming down those stairs. Mum and Dad, sister in arms, telling me Christmas was here. They just let me sleep in. Maybe it had even snowed. Maybe that was why the light seemed so odd, pale and diffused. God, I wanted a white Christmas so badly. It was all over the telly, in movies and magazines, but all it ever seemed to do around us at that time of year was rain in a fine wet drizzle. Black windows come night, heavy winds, puddles that reflected street lamps. My only memory of my grandmother was her singing, "Rain, rain, go away, come back another day." Nothing else, not a face, just the sound of her singing that old nursery rhyme. Like Alex, she was another person I knew largely through the grief she left behind in others. I climbed the basement stairs on my hands and feet, following some hidden instinct to be quiet. Years of sneaking around to listen to Mum and Dad's fevered arguments had taught me to always put my weight on the edge of my steps. Whenever I spied them mid-fight, Mum would be standing somewhere looking thin and sad, arms crossed, with the smell of cigarettes strong in the air. I thought of this as I reached the top, pausing to sniff the air, wondering if I might smell smoke coming from somewhere further in the house. Instead, I picked out a gentle whiff of something burned, not dissimilar to the smell of party poppers or old fireworks. Certainly nothing like old cigarettes. And there was something else in there too. Something behind that black and sooty odor. Something metallic. Almost sweet. Eventually, I looked, lifting my head over the final step and peering left and right down the hallway that stretched either side. For a long time, there was nothing, and I stayed in place, frozen by indecision. But then, somewhere to my right, near the kitchen doorway, the cold morning light that filtered through seemed to shift and move. Someone was in there, surely, moving around and casting shadows. Of course, it could be Mum or Dad, I told myself. But I still did not move. Whoever it was, they were silent, deathly so. When I finally got the courage to move, it was to go in the opposite direction. Not yet 10 years old, but even a child has an animal's instincts, and mine were telling me to avoid anyone who was that quiet. So I crawled towards the living room, letting the old carpet absorb the sound of my movements. When I looked inside, I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It was like a bomb had gone off. The sofa was torn to shreds. The coffee table lay in pieces. All of our Christmas decorations lay crushed beneath broken floorboards and ripped up carpet. The bear traps stood upright, their teeth locked, their jaws snapped shut. Dad's piston was in 2 bits, the oxygen canister embedded in one wall, the barrel bent and lying on the floor. The sight of our traps destroyed set something off in me. I hadn't thought of it until that moment, but they had always been an integral part of our Christmas decorations. A little different to the usual fare, sure, but every bit as important to us as anyone else's homemade decorations. Everywhere I looked, there was another little bit of our history lying in a broken heap, and it broke my little heart because I so desperately wanted to fix them, to return the living room to the pristine state it had been in the night before, when we'd been a happy family. I wondered if maybe Dad's little invention had gone wrong somehow. One year he nearly burned the house down, so it wasn't strange to think that dangerous-looking piston was responsible for all that destruction, all that pressure building up. Still no sign of my family though. Didn't look like they'd been caught in anything either. No blood. Back in the hallway, I looked at the light cast by the kitchen door. There was no further movement, but I didn't trust the stillness in the air. Wrong. All wrong. Best chance now was to try upstairs. Same goes as before, really. It involved making my way to the front door where the stairs leading up were near, and then slowly and carefully climbing them on all fours. I knew these steps very well, and disappeared up them as stealthily as anyone could hope to. My bedroom was empty. So was my sister's. She had a big window, so I got a good look at the world outside and saw the sun was well on its way to rising. Early morning light and heavy fog made everything look washed out and faded. Eerie too, like the world was holding its breath. In a way, it was. My parents' bedroom looked empty too at a glance, and I almost moved on without noticing the strange and heavy shadow beneath their bed. I'm glad I didn't. I lingered and looked a little harder. Something about the light down there convinced me it wasn't empty, not like normal. And before I had any time for my imagination to start conjuring up nightmares, my sister's face appeared from the gloom. I nearly yelped from joy, but the expression she wore was as serious as they come. Not just afraid or concerned, but almost sick, pale with wide eyes. It was like she couldn't quite register my presence. So I slinked forward and reached out, touching her hand. She flinched and receded further into the darkness. Something was wrong, so I crawled in beside her and checked her for injuries, doing my best not to alarm her further. She looked fine, so all I could do was take her in my arms and try my best to coax her out of her shock. When I finally whispered a question, it felt far too loud, even though the only real sound was the smacking of my lips. She recoiled a little when I spoke, making me feel like I'd broken the most precious silence of our lives. But I had to ask. I had to know. "Where's Mum and Dad?" She merely shook her head, so I asked again, this time trying my best to stay even quieter, but it seemed like any sound was going to alarm her. "Where are they?" In the end, she replied only so that I would stop asking. She pulled away as she did so. She loved me, but, well, she was an animal with a hiding place, and I was at risk of ruining it. "He took them up there," was the only thing she'd said, all pointing at the roof. Those 5 words chilled me to the core. They carried some subtle implication that our parents were dead. I didn't like this thought. It made my skin itch, made the space we'd crawled into feel too small and uncomfortable. A hot sensation began to well up in my throat, threatening tears. Was she really saying we were alone? I didn't want that. I didn't want to be alone. I wanted them to come back and sweep us up in their arms. Without really knowing why, I refused to believe her. I shook my head and crawled out from under the bed, hoping to go off and find them. I looked back briefly to see if she followed, but she remained. Seeming all too ready to leave me to go off to my fate, she disappeared into the shadows, and I was left with only the slim comfort that she might at least be safe there. Out of sight, out of mind. Crawling out of our parents' bedroom, I realized I had very few options left. There was the phone on the downstairs landing by the front door. It was that, or maybe I could run down the lane and out to the nearest house, which was maybe a quarter mile away. Not far under normal circumstances. But did I really want to go sprinting out the front door, hoping to God that whatever had marched through all those traps like nothing wouldn't see me running out in the open? Better to get help to come to us. Better to reach the phone. I thought of Grandpa, Mum's dad, a hulking man who generally terrified us all, a cantankerous old widower who had a bad habit of telling us things Mum said we shouldn't know, like how it was our grandmother's fault we had to be scared of the chimney at Christmas. I didn't like him. He smelt of mildew and soil, a hulking giant who told us awful stories of growing up with a part-time job in a slaughterhouse that made me want to cry. But right then, I couldn't think of a better man to ask for help. I made it down the stairs as quietly as I had ascended them. I lifted the phone gingerly from the receiver like it was ready to explode. I didn't know what might make a noise, if anything. Didn't know if the table would rock from a wobbly leg, if the plastic would click from hitting something, or the dial tone would be a little too loud. When you're trying to be quiet, everything feels dangerous. Every moment, every object, it's all just another way to get caught out. One of the reasons I thought of Grandpa was he was on speed dial. I pressed the 3 and listened to the ringtone. I was tense at the sound, muted as it was, and waited eagerly for this part to be over. The whole time, I couldn't take my eyes off the hallway that turned towards the basement and the kitchen. Occasionally, a muffled creak or groan would emanate from somewhere inside, and my skin would crawl. I'd never known a longer, more unsettling wait in my entire life. When it was finally over, there came no relief. Grandpa didn't answer the phone with tact. Old men usually don't. I hadn't expected the sound of his voice to be so damn loud. "Hello, Alice? Is that you?" It was probably just the atmosphere, but it sounded like the old bugger was bellowing the words in the very room I was in. Terrified of how that noise might carry, I slammed the phone down on the receiver and cringed at the sound of the internal bell ringing with the force. If there really was someone in that house, they must have heard that. I wasted no time in waiting. I ran, not crawled up the stairs, still trying to be as quiet as I could, but putting a good emphasis on speed. As I climbed, I wondered if maybe I was overreacting. But no. From the kitchen came the sound of breaking glass and clattering metal, like someone had torn a cutlery drawer right out of the cupboard and hurled it against the wall. Whatever had been in there was moving faster than it had any right to. Heavy footfalls closed the unseen distance, turning the corner and reaching the front door and stairs just in time for me to disappear over the top step and drop to the floor. The fear that gripped me was electric. All the paranoia I'd been feeling up until this point felt thin and plastic in comparison. The way that, as a kid, you might run back from the bathroom, convinced that something evil lurked in the shadows, when really, deep down, you knew there was nothing. But this was a deep and grueling fear. I could hear something smashing the phone and little table to smithereens, and I had just been standing there. A visceral fear coursed through my body as I crawled on my stomach as fast as I could towards the nearest door, which happened to be my own bedroom. It made my vision pulsate and my stomach twist and churn, urging me to crawl on my belly faster and faster, like a soldier dodging gunfire. Once inside, I briefly considered hiding under the bed like my sister, but something about that didn't feel safe enough. I wanted something, a door, a wall, anything that I could put between me and whatever had made that noise. The closet, I decided. That made sense. It was full of old junk I could squeeze between, and a small hatch that led into the attic. All of this flashed through my mind in a split second, and I veered towards the closet door just in time to hear the first step coming up the stairs. God, whatever it was heavy. I could hear the wood creak and the banister crack and splinter as it forced its way up. I was breathing so hard now, I was nearly whimpering with each movement, coming damn close to losing control over my muscles and my bladder. I felt like the finest piece of twine was holding me all together. My body, my mind, my sanity. All of it waiting for that final thread to break and for it all to come undone at once, collapsing into a heap as I messed myself, choking on desperate sobs and tears. I don't quite know how I made it to the closet in such silence. I managed to open the door and crawl inside without making a noise, and then watched in terror through the slits in the door as I waited for God knows what to happen. Whatever it was out there, in the hallway landing, sniffing the air. I expected some sort of animal by this point, a twisted reindeer for some reason, probably the season, and the sound of its hefty snorts reinforced that, but when it finally poked its head through the open doorway to look for me, I saw something that was perplexingly human, or at least had been. Hard to say. As a family, even now, we don't talk about it. Not before that day, not after, not any of the extended family reunions where all the branches in my line come together and discuss tactics for dealing with the curse. It, whatever it is, seems to deliberately play on our expectations. Talking about it makes you sound mad, even if it is with other members of the family. I don't know how else to put it. You feel silly. Make the problem feel silly by extension, like you don't need to take it as seriously. Of course, the curse is not some random force. It has a sense of humor, I want to say. Taunting, cruel, certainly. It hurts to admit this, but everything it does, all of the dead, and there are plenty of them, for my grandmother had a lot of children, and they all went off and had children too. So much so, there were 11 households at the last reunion, giving it plenty of victims to choose from. But all of it, all the pain and misery, landing on the roof, climbing down the chimney, leaving safely if it was hit by a single one of our traps. It was a damn game. They were tricks. It was playing tricks on us, and it always had been. And these tricks were part of a game that had rules, and why we had to have the chimney, because if we didn't, it would behave unpredictably. And that's why the thing poked its head through my door, wearing a Santa hat and a white beard. I hate this, by the way. I hate going over how the worst night of my life was some kind of joke to it. But yeah, that's what it was. It wore a Santa hat and a beard, and in truth, it made for a pretty terrifying image. Especially to a 10-year-old. Wasn't human, wasn't animal either. Looked like a rotting corpse. Something you'd find withered and preserved out in the Alaskan tundra, only for some scientists to say it's some caveman from the Pleistocene. It may have been some kind of dead thing actually. It was leaking a foul grey fluid from its lipless mouth, crowned by yellow teeth, and its cheap nylon beard was matted with the stuff. God, I can almost smell it just talking about it. This ghoul came and went in seconds. It didn't know which room I'd gone in, so it made only a brief sweep of mine before leaving to go take a proper look elsewhere. A part of me considered shouting out to help my sister, but, well, I couldn't have moved my arms to do that if I wanted to. Instead, I thought of how it was almost definitely going to take a closer look at this room once it didn't find me elsewhere. Maybe it found my sister first, but I didn't really want to think about that. Instead, I kept imagining it returning to this place and stomping around, opening drawers, looking under the bed, and surely it would turn its head at one point towards my closet, see the slatted door, and realize exactly where I'd been hiding all along. I had to move on from this place, and looking up, I remembered the entry to the attic, accessible from the very top shelf. This was my best chance, my only chance really. I began to climb, only this wasn't the graceful and quiet sneaking I'd been relying on so far. Unlike the stairs, I hadn't made a habit of going this way silently. I made it 2 shelves before I knocked an old Transformer toy off where it hit the ground with a plastic clack. Another time, another place, the noise would have barely registered. But to me, and that thing outside, it might as well have been a gunshot. As quickly as the head had disappeared, that monster came roaring into my room, and I began to climb with quivering arms that came close to flailing out of control. I didn't look back. I reached the top, pushed the hatch open, and pulled myself through just in time to hear the closet door torn off its hinges. Once through, I couldn't stop myself turning around briefly, and that thing was right there, grinning at me. It saw me. It knew where I was. There was no hiding now, only running. This time, I really did lose control of my bladder. When one of its clawed hands wrapped around the hatch, I realized I had to keep going, keep running, keep moving. I didn't know my way around the attic, but that didn't matter right now. I had to keep going, keep putting distance, any distance, between me and it. Unfortunately, the way wasn't very clear. My family, like most, had jammed a lot of old junk into the attic. At first, when I turned and saw the piles of old boxes, I nearly panicked at the claustrophobic maze that faced me. But when I had to get on my hands and knees to crawl through the only way forward, I came to hope that maybe it meant that that thing wouldn't be able to follow. This hope spurred me on, but I was only halfway through the tunnel of old plastic and cardboard when there came the overpowering stench of rotting meat, letting me know that that thing was closer than I dared to imagine. Then, what little light there was went away, and something grabbed my ankle. I screamed. This was the moment where I was meant to wake up. This was the moment when something was meant to happen to stop the terror. I pulled at the boxes around me, and they came tumbling down, spilling old furniture and photos, and I grabbed at them too, hoping for some kind of leverage. But this thing was big, and it hauled me out like a hunter plucking a rabbit out of its warren. Briefly, it held me upside down and surveyed me, and I stared into black, sunken eyes and a gaunt face covered in lesions and pocks. With a smirk, it grabbed something from over its shoulder, put it on the floor, and before I even realized what was happening, it had stuffed me into a sack and thrown me over its shoulder. The world became a blur. I felt my mind close in on itself, and the world narrow to a point as I fought to stop my thoughts racing with images of what might happen to me, of being dragged into its home where that wretched mouth would open wide to swallow me whole, of being killed or butchered or tortured. I don't know if you can really imagine what it was like for me as a kid to curl up in that dark space and contemplate my own mortality, to come face to face with my own death or worse. But it broke me, irreparably and completely. To this day, I am broken because of it, because of that moment. So much so that when it dropped me down with a heavy thump on the fireplace mantel, I did not even move or try to escape. I already knew where it was taking me, of course. Up the chimney. Where else? And it was too late. The fight was lost. If anything, at this point, I wanted it to be over with. I wanted to be with Mom and Dad. Instead, the moments stretched on and on. Seconds turned to minutes, and I waited with held breath for this nightmare to move on. But it didn't. It must have been making preparations for something. But what? And how long? Eventually, I opened my eyes. Thin light made its way through the coarse fabric of the sack, enough for me to make out a vague outline of the destroyed living room. But the opening of the sack had also fallen slightly, and a small aperture was visible where the cord that bound it wasn't quite pulled tight enough. And there, like some strange reminder, was a broken HB pencil. A tiny little piece of my trap. One night, one sleep. That was all that had separated me from this nightmare. Just the day before, we'd been happy, or something close to it, and I remembered that not only had this thing taken me away, it had also taken my mother, my father, and even Alex, who I knew only through ancient memories and a room my mother didn't like letting me into. And there was a damn good chance it was going to get my sister too. All of it gone, leaving behind an empty house with broken things that no one else would care about. Not the tree, not the presents, not any of it. I felt something wash up from within me, an anger, a petulant, childish tantrum. I was screwed anyway, right? I had lost everything, so why not? I reached out, grabbed the pencil, and poking my head out of the sack, saw that thing enter the room with my sister held by her ankle in one of its misshapen fists. She was bawling hysterically, and I hoped that with this final action, I might somehow save her. I crawled out of the bag, launched myself at it, and jammed the broken pencil into its booted foot. Immediately, it dropped my sister, and I stayed where I was on the floor, sobbing, head bowed, waiting for the rest to come. Only nothing did. Instead, that thing had sighed. A bone, deep, weary sigh, the kind a parent lets out when they realize their toddler has been quiet for too long. With a voice like gravel, it spoke in a harsh Germanic accent, spitting some of the words from between its broken teeth. So close this year. Good trap, little one. But I will not fall for this one twice. With one of its clawed hands, it pulled the pencil out of his foot and stomped away. And I passed out before I had the chance to hear the rest. It was our grandfather who eventually found us both, huddled together on the living room floor. The next month or so was a blur. A lot changed. We were taken into my grandfather's care, and we had to bury our parents, not to mention moving out, sorting the home. Our contribution to this wasn't much, of course. We were kids, but we still had to go back and get some of our things. I don't remember much of it, to be honest. My grandfather, years later, would sit me down and give me an account of the night as best he could. My father's piston trap had gone wrong and blown half the living room to smithereens. Bad luck on any day, but this time it had happened the year that thing came to visit us. And with no traps left, it had a clean run into the house where it wrought its havoc. Only has to be a nick, my grandfather said with a stoic shrug while gesturing a cut on his palm. Your father overcomplicated things. I told him this after the time he caused the fire. Too much. Trap has to work in principle, not practical. No need for compressors or pistons. That is why your piston, sent it away. You made trap hurt it, it go away. Those rules. We follow rules. Give it chimney to come down, play its game, we win or it wins. Either way, it has its fun. He spat the last words. Can't blame him. No part of that was fun for us. But at least Grandpa was honest with us. He explained the curse as best he knew it. the rules, the traps, introduced us to our extended family from Germany, and we learned that the game is played with at least one household from the family every year, and it helps to stay in touch and talk about what did, or, God forbid, did not work. As for its origin, well, our grandmother took that to her grave, unfortunately. Grandpa didn't know it, nor did anyone else. Might have been something from her childhood, maybe. A deal with something she found in the woods. Who knows? It doesn't matter. He was a miserable man who raised us as best he could, but I could at least understand why he was so cantankerous and difficult. He'd fallen in love with a woman and gotten her pregnant before the first Christmas, having no idea what lay in wait. And then, when he found out the bizarre truth, he stuck it out, year after year, one painful loss after another. I admire him for it, admired the way he didn't let anything get to him. At least, not in front of us. Because I do remember some things about waking up that day, about him finding us. I remember that the monster, having lost its game, had returned our parents to us. Only, it was a little too late for them. I remember wet sacks beneath the chimney, blood leaking from the fabric. My parents were cremated for good reason. Whatever it had done to them, well, that thing is a sick and twisted creature, that's for sure. I can only assume that's why, after returning the sacks, it had taken little tags and tied them around the top, gifting our parents back to us, even after it had butchered them until only ribbons remained. "Merry Christmas, little ones," the tag read. "And so many more to come." Back in 2017, I was about 6 months out of an internship with a local law firm. I was a junior legal assistant as part of a retainer team for a statewide biodiesel business. It wasn't my only assignment, but it was the one I was formally hired for. However, during downtime, I was bounced around various teams all throughout the year. It was early February when the call came. The biodiesel place had a new owner, and he wanted to shake things up. Our jobs were safe, but he wanted to make some investments. New manufacturing plants, 2 in Missouri and 1 to the west, within reasonable driving distance from their warehouses. Only problem was, there were no suitable properties to build on. This could be a multi-million-dollar kind of thing, but we didn't have a property to sign off on. That is, until I realized that the area they were looking at was my old hometown of Tomskog, Minnesota. I suggested looking into an old property I'd gone by 1,000 times on my way to school. It was this massive empty field in the outskirts of town with nothing but a few rundown houses that could easily be torn down. We knew the place was privately owned, but had no idea of who the proprietor was. My boss was ecstatic. See, the client had been considering calling the whole thing off, but if we could offer them a property, we could probably get a fat bonus check along with a finder's fee. It would be enough to take the junior part off my job title. Since I suggested it, I was given time off to get in touch with the owner of the property. There were some initial problems. The original property documents had been damaged in a flood back in 2014, and only part of the archive had been digitized. The document I was looking for might not have been digitized yet, and since no immediate documents were available, I was starting to suspect the worst. The clerk at the municipal office promised they'd get back to me with a name within 4 to 8 weeks, 12 at the most. That wasn't an option. So I packed my bags, handed my cat to my mom, got the fancy maroon BMW company car, and set my sights on familiar roads. It took me 2 stops for gas and a needlessly complicated detour because of a fallen oak tree, but I made my way back to that field just as the sun started to set. After all these years, it was exactly as I remembered. One large empty property, now covered in mud-stained February snow, a rundown barn at the edge of the property, and a small 1-story log cabin right next door. All roads were overgrown, and there were no discernible paths out there. I considered going back in the morning, but I figured I had some time left. Maybe there was this big plaque with the name of the owner out front. If so, I could have it all settled in a day and be on my way home before I even had time to unpack. It was getting late and the shadows had grown longer, but I was willing to roll those dice. I double-checked my phone, got a flashlight from the trunk, and locked my car. The snow was deep enough to reach my knees. My fancy shoes felt like paper. The cold went straight through. Still, I pushed on, beelining straight across the field. I severely overestimated how much time I had left. By the time I got to the cabin, it was already getting dark. Using the flashlight, I took a quick lap around the place, just to make sure I wasn't walking into some kind of hillbilly trap room. It didn't take long for me to realize that this place had been abandoned for years. Not only was it boarded up, but the boards used were rotten. That the place was standing at all was nothing short of a miracle. I tried knocking a little, just to make sure no one was home, but I wasn't holding my breath. The place was desolate. I looked for some kind of name or plaque or hell, something carved into the wall somewhere, anything. But there really was nothing. I considered coming back in the morning, but I could see dark clouds on the horizon, and I didn't want to walk through that snow more times than necessary. I decided I'd do a little urban exploring. After all, if the door was open, it wouldn't hurt to have a peek inside. I walked up to the door. I noticed something strange. There was a carving at the top of the door frame. Word by word, my flashlight revealed the full sentence. No one has ever lived in this house. I tried to wrap my brain around it. It didn't make much sense. What the hell did that even mean? Of course someone had lived there. Someone built it, and someone owned the property. Why would there be a house in the middle of nowhere that no one had ever lived in? I hesitated. Something told me to just walk away and come back in the morning, but the clouds on the horizon and my freezing feet were telling me otherwise. There was a carving. That meant someone had the habit of leaving messages. Chances were, there might be more of them inside. Twiddling the handle a little, I noticed the door was unlocked. So, in I went. The cabin had a very basic layout. There was one large room with a wooden bench facing a simple fireplace. There were 2 handmade tables, and the westernmost wall was lined with dried herbs, mostly blue and black. There was a surprisingly clean cow skin on the floor, as well as a small door on the easternmost side of the room leading to a kitchen. It was mostly just an antique kind of stove and a couple of cabinets, but whoever lived there must have been accustomed to a sparse lifestyle. But no, that wasn't it. I had to correct myself. The carving said no one had ever lived there. Then, why the furniture? I decided to ignore the message for the time being, instead focusing on finding the name of whoever owned the place. There might be some initials on the handmade furniture. I gently moved the bench and the table first, going over them with my flashlight. There were no obvious markings, but another problem quickly arose. My flashlight was giving up on me. It started to flicker. Looking around, I could see no other possible source of light but the old fireplace, and I couldn't imagine that thing not being clogged. Then again, there was firewood, and I did have a lighter. I quit smoking about 2 years prior, but I always kept it around, just in case. Breaking off a piece of bark and lighting it, I double-checked to make sure the smoke cleared and went up. Surprisingly, it did. Glancing at my phone, I figured I could use it for a flashlight as well, but I didn't want to drain the battery. Instead, I lit a fire and left the front door open, just in case the smoke didn't entirely clear out. Carbon monoxide poisoning ain't no joke. As the fire sputtered to life, I sat down to take a breather on the bench. It was a pretty cozy little cabin, the kind of place you'd stay in a night or two when going fishing. I could imagine my dad warming his hands by that fire. I lost him in 2010, but that was the kind of place he'd always been most at home in. As I warmed my hands, watching my shadows grow longer, I could imagine him sitting next to me. I could almost hear him. And in that moment, my eyes drifted to a space right in front of the fireplace. A space where a small iron plate protected the floor. I don't know what drove me to look closer, but I realized there were no screws or nails keeping that plate down. So, with a quick touch of the fire poker, it came loose, revealing a sort of makeshift metal box. There were 4 items in total: a broken pocket watch, an empty hip flask, 3 spent shotgun shells, and a small journal. I went straight for the journal, checking for a name. It was getting darker outside, so I huddled around the fire. As snow began to tap against the wooden barricades, I had 2 choices: to steal this journal or to read it by the fire as the storm raged on. It was my cold feet that decided for me. I took off my shoes and warmed them by the fire as I started to slowly read my way through the rough cursive text of the old journal. Not the kind of job I'd imagine I'd do at a law firm, but things never quite go the way you've planned. I opened the first page, hoping to find a name. Instead, I was greeted by a strange text. Journal, written by. Then nothing. That was it. No name, just that. I turned the book over, back and forth. No name anywhere. I kept reading. The first page reads as follows. I once had a name and creed, a couple of truths thrown to the grave long before my end. Now I remain, battered and empty. My history is unusual as my mind turns sun-bleached and distant. My heart burns of wrath, but I cannot recall as to why. I turned the page. I couldn't help but to be intrigued, if not for any other reason than to find the name of the author. This house is not my property, and to my recollection, no one has ever lived here. He proceeded to discuss, at length, the part of his history that he did remember. Growing up in Wisconsin, being the son of a shoemaker, little anecdotes of a long life, his first kiss, his first love, his first house. But the further along he tried to remember, the foggier it got. I was starting to think I might never find a name, but I wasn't sure why. At some point, the author recalled something happening. He couldn't explain what or why or where, but he could recall something upsetting his routine. Something came to him and it made him upset. He spoke about putting up barricades, keeping a loaded shotgun at the ready, and locking himself inside for days on end. "It might have been here that I made my stand," he wrote. "It could be worse. It should be, but I can't say that it was." He would go on to detail some sort of struggle, but he couldn't picture what it was against. The text was so strangely written. I could tell there were segments as if written piece by piece, but it was impossible to tell just how much time had passed between them. Even in the journal, the author lamented on large segments of time randomly missing. I couldn't help but to consider the other items in the box, in particular, the spent shotgun shells. The author proceeded to explain how he'd broken the pocket watch as it frustrated him. He was losing track of time. He might think 10 minutes had passed, only to realize the entire afternoon was gone. He broke his watch as a reminder that he couldn't trust himself anymore. "Maybe I'll remember that," he wrote, "or will the watch unbreak itself?" I was disrupted from my read by a sudden noise. Looking up, I could see the fire was dying out, but the sound actually came from my phone. Turns out it was my automated time to go to bed alert. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours. That didn't make sense. I stood up, clutching the journal. There was nothing there. The cabin was empty, but I couldn't escape this sudden sense of dread, like something awful had just happened, but I couldn't say exactly what. Looking down on the journal, I suddenly realized that I felt exactly as described by the author. I felt this unexplainable anxiousness, like that uneasy feeling you get when you feel that someone is watching you, only more palpable. Standing up with my back to the fireplace, I continued reading. He continued to explain how his flask was empty, but that he couldn't remember drinking from it. He detailed his plan to conceal a few items along with his journal for an entire day, just to see if he could remember to retrieve it. "But not yet," he lamented. "There are trespasses to deal with." This is where the spent shells came into play. The author revealed how he'd found a group of strange trespassers. He'd taken them all out with his shotgun. He wrote in detail about shooting 3 times, but that he couldn't remember anything about them. Men, women, or children, there was no way to tell. "I buried them by the barn," he detailed. "It seemed like the right thing to do. Why am I crying?" As the journal neared its end, the author tried to summarize his remaining thoughts. Something came to him wherever he was. It did something, and as a result, everything was destroyed. He was devastated, but couldn't even remember why. It was like muscle memory. Something in his body was remembering the sadness. "I inscribe upon this door," he wrote, "that no one has ever lived here. I do not recall this place or anyone living here. It serves as a warning and a reminder that this is not my home." And with the final page, the author documented putting it all in a sort of hidden lockbox in front of the fireplace. He would do so for one day to see if he could remember retrieving it. Evidently, he couldn't. With the final words on the final page, he gave one last piece of insight, perhaps in a moment of clarity. "It started when I lit the fire," he wrote. "Everything turned worse after I lit the fire." Looking back at the fireplace and the sputtering logs, I slowly came to the realization of what kind of situation I'd put myself in. I accidentally followed the footsteps of a man who used to be in that cabin, a man that might have owned it, but couldn't even remember it. Or who knows, maybe he was just passing by. I decided to take my chances and just leave. I brought the journal along, opened the door, and prepared to brave the weather. But something happened. Right then and there, something made me stop. And I just stood there. I stood there long enough for my hands to turn blue, and I only snapped out of it when a snowflake hit my eye. I wasn't alone. There was something there, and it was doing something to me. I had rung the damn dinner bell. Thinking about it, it feels a bit like being eaten alive. Not physically, but the same feeling remains. This heedless consumption, something taking an intimate part of what makes you into you and tearing it away. That's what I still remember. That's what it feels like. But it is hard to explain something I can't remember. It feels like a void in your mind, but you have this instinct to fill it with something bad, like watching a scary movie and knowing something horrifying is about to pop up. Every time I think about it, trying to picture it in my mind, I get that same feeling. Sometimes my mind fills it with a sort of organic darkness, roughly shaped as a person. Other times it's just some guy. It changes whenever I look back at it, because there is nothing there for me to remember, so my mind fills in the blanks. But who's to say that all those blanks are false? I turned around and realized I'd been exposed to this thing. It was doing something to me, and it was bad enough to make me run head first into the dark. Looking back at this, all I really remember was feeling that immense panic, a prey reflex, like trying to escape a wild animal. I ended up in the old barn, where I hid behind a mound of debris next to one of those collapsed walls. My fingers were freezing, but I was going to call for help no matter what. Only problem was, I couldn't remember the code to unlock my phone. I tried, but between my fingers being too cold to register and something unfathomable approaching from just around the corner, I decided it was better to hunker down and be quiet. Because while I can't remember anything about the physical features of it, I remember thinking it wasn't very perceptive for some reason. It passed me by, but I couldn't make any sounds without revealing my position. Calling for help was out of the question. Instead, I turned my attention back to the journal. My lock screen had a bright picture blurred in the background, allowing me to use it as a makeshift mini flashlight of sorts. For some reason, I wasn't afraid that the creature would spot me visually. Perhaps it didn't have eyes? I turned the pages back and forth, looking for a particular segment. There was something about the weapon the author had used to deal with the intruders that left me wondering, but I could barely make out anything in that journal. Between my pounding heart, my freezing hands, and the strange thing lurking about, I couldn't make heads or tails of the damned cursive text. I can't remember what kind of sounds the creature made, but I can remember the sounds the environment made when it passed. I remember wood splintering as something climbed the walls. I remember creaking wood from a sudden weight coming down. I remember a door splintering as it was torn from its hinges. Finally, I found the page I was looking for. Just after talking about how he didn't know why he was sad about killing the intruders, the author wrote, "I threw the damn thing into the hayloft. I have not been able to retrieve it, as the memory of its shape eludes me. How does one recognize a weapon that one has no recollection of ever wielding?" I waited for the entity to step outside before I made my way upstairs. It is a strange feeling, trying to balance the instinct to run with the obsessive thought of staying quiet. Every creaking floorboard sent shivers down my spine, curling my toes in anticipation of something running me down. But nothing happened. It didn't take long for me to find it, an old double-barreled hunting rifle. Looking over it, I saw that there was some sort of shell still loaded. Perhaps it would work, perhaps not. I was no expert, and I didn't have much of a choice but to try. I'd be a sitting duck out there without it. After all, I couldn't remember where I'd parked my car. I decided to go on the offensive. I made my way down the stairs a little too quick, and before long I heard this scurrying noise as something entered the old barn. I remember standing a good 15 feet away from it and raising the weapon towards it. It stopped, but so did I. For a while, we just sort of circled one another. I remember my movement being in response to a threat. Is this eat or play?" I asked. "If this is you eating, I bet all those memories disappear after a while, digested. Then you wouldn't remember what this is, or what it does. But you do, don't you?" I remember tapping the gun for emphasis. There was a long pause, but I can't remember why. Did it respond? Could it talk? "If you're just playing, then you might remember that this thing is loaded," I continued, "and you might know what it does. You saw what happened when he used it. You heard it." A shorter pause. We stopped circling. I gripped the weapon tighter and stepped forward, advancing. If this was a consumer, and it worked in any way like we do, it would absorb and convert what it fed on into some sort of nutrient. But if it was just collecting, for some reason, then it would have this archive of thoughts to recollect from. That was my reasoning. Or maybe it was just clever. Maybe it was just as clever as I was. I made my way back outside. Even in the newly fallen snow, I managed to find what remained of the path I'd made when I first got there. I walked backwards down the path, my rifle readily aimed at something. I didn't want to pull the trigger. If it misfired or I missed, I was dead. Just having the means of defending myself was enough to keep it away. For now. I think it had left some sort of toxin in me. Despite not being anywhere near me, I still felt the effects of it. I kept falling into this sort of fugue state, getting turned around and losing grip of where I was going and why. At one point, I was just standing there, gawking at the dark as my rifle thumped to the ground. But there, in the dark, a memory surfaced. The same memory I'd felt back in the cabin. Thoughts of my dad taking me fishing. Back then, we'd worn rubber boots, and instead of snow, there was mud. It was still deep, and I had to walk the same way that I did in the snow. Maybe that's what triggered the memory to begin with. I tried to keep that image in my head, the anticipation as we gathered our bait, learning how to tie a proper knot, getting the correct measurements for the distance between the hook, the weight, and the bobber. I could almost hear the spinning fish line as the red and white bobber sailed across the lake. Just holding onto something I knew I couldn't forget was all I needed. It became this sort of bedrock, keeping me from completely losing my mind and focus. I could keep going, holding onto something I knew to be true. It was a backstop, keeping me from losing track. I grabbed the rifle and pressed on. As I did, I remember something rustling the nearby trees, retreating into the woods. By the time I had made it to my car, the toxin had completely taken hold of me. At that point, I had little to nothing to hold on to, but for a few cherished memories. I crawled into my car, locked all the doors, and tucked myself into a fetal position in the back seat, still clutching the rifle. My body didn't know how to react. I was hot, cold, wide awake, and deeply unconscious, all seemingly at random. I would lose my sense of object permanence, bobbing my head back and forth, completely forgetting what I was doing and what was even happening. At one point, something made the passenger door creak. Maybe someone tried to open it. Luckily, all the doors were locked, and I had the keys. I remember laying in the back of the car, raising the rifle. Then there was a pause, a long one. Something made me shake my head. It made me angry and afraid, very afraid. It left me with this sense of a rabbit being stared down by a pack of wolves. I had something it wanted, something it deeply valued. Again, this creature is just nothingness. I can't recall what it looked like, or if it was even a physical being. From context, I think it could talk. I think it said something to me that I didn't want to hear. And to this day, when I think of it, my mind just conjures these otherworldly horrors. Teeth, skin, claws. But I didn't lower my rifle, not for a second. I didn't try my luck, and I didn't challenge fate. And by the time the sun rose, it was gone. And with it went the sweat, the confusion, and much of the memory voids. First thing I did was check the shotgun shell. Turns out, it was already spent. Empty. That leaves a lot of questions, uncomfortable ones. If that thing was just collecting, it would have known that I couldn't hurt it. If it knew that, why did it let me go? Did I trade it something? How would I even know? But if it was just feeding, then how did it know to stay away from the rifle? I have managed to put this story together piece by piece. Some of my memories are still a bit touch and go, but this is the most complete retelling I can make. I've tried to fill in as many blanks as I can, but it's hard. I kept the journal. I think I still have it somewhere. I showed it to my boss, but it was a weak comfort. The client eventually ended up choosing another site, leaving us in an awful position. Needless to say, that trip didn't get me promoted. That happened years later. Yeah, I still worked there. Same firm. I get the feeling that this thing didn't just make people forget things. It made people be forgotten too. Despite all my efforts, not a single person I've met or talked to can remember anyone ever hearing anything about the people who used to live here. Even the cleric at the municipal office kept forgetting I'd even made the request to inquire about the land to begin with. That might have just been laziness though. But I get this feeling that I'm missing something. Even though I've wrapped my head around most of this and most of what happened out there, I often get the feeling that I lost something. In those moments when everything in the world feels uncertain and half true, I look back at that day with my dad. I listen to the spinning of the fishing line. But here's the thing. This is what bothers me. This is what made me want to post, to kind of save this for posterity, like a journal of my own, hidden by my own fireplace. Lately, I can't remember what my dad's eyes looked like. Am I just forgetting? Or is something forgetting it for me? My hometown of Cedar Creek, Colorado, had a woman who everyone loved to hate. Her name was Miss Gatlin, and she was both my elementary school's janitor and the scapegoat for all unfortunate events around our town. The Cedar Creek elderly despised her for having a son out of wedlock, and the town parents scorned her for giving said son too much freedom, a parenting style which had supposedly led to his death at the hands of our town's eponymous river. As for the children of Cedar Creek, we didn't care at all about social conventions or parental negligence, but we all agreed that Miss Gatlin was an ugly lady, and that was enough to warrant our cruelty. My best friend at the time was a curly-haired menace to society named Isaac, who, by 5th grade, had established himself as a ringleader amongst the neighborhood boys. He did his best to inconvenience Miss Gatlin, though his pranks did little to rattle her. If we spread rumors about her poor hygiene just within earshot, Miss Gatlin didn't bat an eye. If we released bugs inside a janitorial closet, she'd calmly sweep them outside. If we stuffed rotten food inside a locker, she'd clean it out quietly and without complaint. Our usual tricks never worked on Miss Gatlin, and all of us unimaginative kids were stumped by how to best a woman whose job it was to clean up messes of all kinds. In my last year of primary school, Hanukkah fell a week and a half before we were dismissed for winter break. All of the Jewish children thoroughly enjoyed showing off their gifts to the rest of us, who had to wait an eternity for our presents. Thanks to Kim Possible, Spy Kids and Totally Spies, every kid in Cedar Creek was obsessed with espionage, so Isaac's gift of a spy tech kit for kids made him even more popular than usual. Most of the kit was cheap plastic junk, but there was a small spy radio that seemed very well manufactured. It consisted of an earpiece and a button-sized microphone, that was supposedly capable of transmitting audio up to a radius of 5 miles. Isaac, myself, and the rest of our crew spent most of the week before winter break running around town and testing the capabilities of the device. The audio quality was surprisingly good, although the earpiece and microphone could only be separated for about 3 miles before the sound became too distorted to understand. It was a novel concept for a few days, but after a while, we grew bored of playing walkie-talkie. Isaac wanted to use it for its intended purpose, surveillance, and he had the perfect target in mind. On the last day before winter break, Isaac and I glued the button-sized device to the back of an old brooch we had found in his sister's jewelry box. We covered it up with a strip of velvet and then glued on the pin and catch, and by the time we were done, you couldn't tell anything was amiss. We put it in a small white box, which we put in my backpack for later. We determined that I would be the one to deliver it, given Isaac's reputation as a prankster. After school, I found Miss Gatlin in the staff break room. She barely looked at me as I walked into the room. I noticed along the far wall of the break room a wall of cubbies, each one marked with the name of a staff member. All of them were filled with gifts and letters, presumably from parents or other employees at the school. All of them, that is, except one. "You can't be in here, kid," Miss Gatlin said to me in a gruff voice. "I know." I swung my backpack onto my stomach and fished around for the box. It had gotten a little banged up in my bag, but I figured she wouldn't really care. I procured it and held it out to her. "But I wanted to give you this before the break." She stopped packing up, turning fully towards me. For a long time, she just stood there, staring suspiciously at the box. Setting her bag down, she took a few steps forward and grabbed the box out of my hand. She gave it a slight rattle, and then opened it slowly. When she saw the brooch, she gingerly took it out of the box and turned it around in her hand. Then she paused again, looking between the glittering, fake emerald and me. "It's not new, sorry. It used to be my mom's," I told her, going off the script Isaac and I had conceived to add more authenticity to the handoff. "She doesn't wear it anymore, but I thought you might like it." Miss Gatlin kept staring at me, her expression unreadable. I half expected her to chuck it into the garbage bin in the corner of the room, but to my relief, she gave me a single nod. "Thank you," she said, and pinned the brooch onto a cardigan carefully, like it was a precious gem and not some cheap hunk of plastic. I gave her a smile that she did not return, and then she shooed me away. Isaac was waiting for me in the woods outside school. I flashed him a thumbs up, and he slapped my back twice in congratulations. He pulled the earpiece out of his backpack and held it between us. I put my ear next to the speaker and was delighted when I could hear movement. The sound was slightly more muffled now by the velvet backing, but the audio quality was still really good. We heard the sound of snow crunching under Miss Gatlin's feet as she walked herself through the woods home. We listened giddily for a few minutes, then raced back to my house to celebrate our success with hot chocolate. Since we had the attention span of two 10-year-old boys, we forgot about our triumph until just a few minutes before Isaac's mom came to pick him up. When I remembered, I pulled out the earpiece, which we had decided would live at my house since it was closer to Miss Gatlin's, and listened. "More than last year, but not as much as the year before last. What do you think about that?" Do you like it? Can you feel it? I see. Me personally, I've loved it since I was a little girl. It falls so prettily. What the heck is she saying? Isaac asked me, as if I had any clue. The better question, in my mind at least, was who the hell was she talking to? She had no kids or husband and didn't have any friends as far as I knew. I dunno, I said. She's talking about snow, I think? Though the question, can you feel it, seemed an odd thing to ask anyone. We sat there, listening to her talk for 5 minutes straight. I'd never heard Miss Gatlin talk that much in my life, even though I'd seen her most days since I was only 5 years old. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure what we had expected, but it certainly wasn't a monologue of that length. We strained our ears, listening for another voice, but heard nothing. Maybe she's schizophrenic? Isaac volunteered. I had no idea what that was, but I trusted his authority. His mom showed up to take him home, and I turned the speaker off to walk him outside. After that, every once in a while, I would turn the speaker on and listen. It seemed that no matter the time, be it early in the morning or late at night, Miss Gatlin was always talking. She talked about all kinds of things, everything from clothing to stocks to the weather to politics. Sometimes she prayed, talking so quickly and quietly that I could only make out 1 out of every 5 or so words. She apologized often and spoke constantly of a promise. Sometimes when I turned on the speaker, all I heard was sobs, and sometimes the conversations were so strange that I couldn't make heads or tails of them. A young woman smiled at me today at the grocery store. Isn't that just the sweetest thing? I felt like it's been so long since someone smiled at me like that. Yes, I know, she was just doing her job. Probably doesn't even know my name. Oh, how hard this has been. How lonesome. But I'm so very close to the finish line. I won't break my promise now. A few days before we returned to school, Isaac and I made the trek over to her house in an attempt to figure out who she was speaking to. I'd seen her house a few times before, and each time I was taken aback by how small it was. Isolated and weathered, her home stood at the edge of the southern woodlands on a large plot of land, off of a street with very little through traffic. I remember standing on the side of the road with Isaac, staring at the little shack-like house, which must have only had room for a bedroom, a bathroom, and maybe a tiny kitchen. There's no way anyone else lives there, Isaac said after a while of standing and staring. We were too far away to peer into the windows, but we were also too afraid to venture any closer. She's either a witch, or she's just some sad, ugly old lady who went crazy from having no friends. Isaac got bored quickly, so we left not too long after that. After we had made our way partway down the street, something compelled me to turn around and give the house a final look. When I did, I saw the unmistakable shape of Miss Gatlin standing on the porch, staring in our direction. I turned away and grabbed a hold of Isaac's arm. "She's watching us," I whispered to him. His eyes grew wide. "Damn," he said. "Should we run?" "No, that'll look suspicious. Let's just keep walking." We walked until we were out of eyeshot, and then we ran all the way home. I'm not quite sure what spooked us so badly, but for some reason, even when I was back in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into my back. And soon they'll all be coming back. It's hard seeing them sometimes, knowing my Oliver was among them once. Sometimes I think I see him. At least it'll get easier soon. Thanks to you. By the time we went back to school, my friends had grown bored of the spy gear. I volunteered to return Isaac's speaker, but he said it was practically useless now since we couldn't retrieve the microphone. Surprisingly, Miss Catlin continued to wear the brooch every day. It was always pinned to her non-work clothes, so the only time she was unbugged, as Isaac put it, was when she was in her janitorial outfit at my school. Seeing her guard the brooch so carefully made me feel kind of bad. Was that the only gift she had gotten for Christmas? Was it the only gift she had gotten in the past decade? Maybe she wasn't a witch or crazy. Maybe she was just lonely and had learned to cope by talking to herself. Months passed. Isaac and company finally coming to terms with the fact that they would never get the rise they were looking for out of Miss Catlin, moved on to terrorizing the curmudgeonly old man who lived across from Cedar Creek Elementary and was always yelling at kids for one reason or another. I was happy for Miss Catlin. One day, in March, I found her sitting on a bench at the edge of campus during lunch. I took a seat next to her, not expecting much. She took one look at me, then fixed her gaze back at the sad-looking sandwich in her hand. "What do you want?" she asked without looking at me. "Nothing, just wanted to sit here." She picked at the sandwich. "We're not friends, kid." "I know, you don't have any friends." "That's right," she nodded. "Maybe one day, though," I said. And to my surprise, she laughed. I didn't realize she was capable of laughing. She looked at me properly for the first time in our brief conversation, and I noticed that she was smiling. It was an unpracticed smile, but a genuine one. "Yeah," she said, "maybe one day." Miss Catlin packed up and headed back to the school building after that. She left a bag of mini Oreos on the bench next to me. I think she did it on purpose. I grew accustomed to checking up on her every now and then, listening to her conversations with herself. Sometimes it almost felt like she was talking to me. Looking back on it now, I realized what a little villain I was, and what an immense invasion of privacy I was committing. I wish that I could take it back now, especially considering what happened next. Friday, May 17th, marked the 10-year anniversary of Oliver Gatlin's death. I kept an eye on Miss Catlin throughout the day, but she didn't seem any more dejected than usual. Maybe things were finally looking up for her. In any case, although I hadn't checked in on her for a while, I decided that evening to see how she was doing. My parents were gone for the week, and I was only allowed to stay at home alone if I stayed inside the whole time, so I had nothing better to do. Not long after sunset, as I lounged on the floor of my bedroom, I turned on the earpiece. Miss Catlin was talking to herself, as always, but there was something strange about her tone. She sounded more excited than ever. "Almost there, almost there, almost there." She repeated those two words over and over until, at exactly 11:44 p.m, she let out a sound that I understood years later to be a cry of triumph. It is done. It's done. Dark angel. Thank you. Thank you. 10 years of solitude, and it was worth every second. Now, angel, bring him back. Bring him back to me. What was she on about now? Were those song lyrics or something? I strained my ears, listening for another person out of habit. But of course, it was only Miss Gatlin's voice. After a moment, her cries of happiness faded, her voice taking on a confused tone. What do you mean? No, that can't be true. I kept my promise. I followed every rule. I let no one in, kept no companions, made no friends. I kept my wish a secret, as you told me. My angel, I sat up slowly, the building terror in her voice putting me on edge, even from miles away. And then she asked a question that still haunts me to this day. What do you mean, I had an audience? There was a moment of silence, and then the surefire sound of the velvet backing of the brooch being ripped away. I could hear her breath, sharper and clearer than ever before, as she repeated a single word. No, 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 no. She withdrew from the microphone, her rapid breaths replaced by what sounded like a front door being thrown open with a bang. There was no more noise from the microphone. I remember standing up in my bedroom, not quite understanding what had just happened, and not quite knowing what to do next. Something told me that I should go downstairs and make sure that the doors were locked, so I told myself to man up and force myself down the stairs to the dark first floor. I made my way around the whole house, checking the doors and windows. Once I was done, I just stood there. Somehow, I knew she was coming, and that there was nothing I could do to stop it. I thought I was hearing the wind, but as it grew louder, I realized I was hearing wailing. I heard it long before I saw her, that gut-wrenching cry, that sound that I'd previously heard only pale imitations of in movies where a mother loses a child. Standing in the darkness of my living room, I watched the sprint from the tree line towards my house. Her mouth was wide open, her eyes glazed over, and her body dressed in a white nightgown. She looked and sounded like something out of my worst night terrors. I dropped to the floor and crawled away from the window, taking cover behind a couch. Why? She howled, her moaning voice rising and falling as she ascended the steps to my front porch and slammed a fist against the door. Why? I needed to get to the phone, but the house phone was right next to the window, and I was petrified. She hit the door so hard, I was afraid that the hinges would give way. How could you do this to me? I clamped a hand over my mouth. She couldn't possibly know for certain that I was in the house, could she? The origin of the wailing shifted as she rounded the wraparound porch, the heavy knocks of a fist against the door giving way to the thudding of her shoes on the wooden porch floor. I stuck my head around the couch and saw no one at the front window, but when I looked at the side, I saw a face hovering inches from the glass. I screamed at the top of my lungs as a fist came into contact with the glass, shattering it. I was so horrified by the rain of blood-speckled glass that I almost missed the sight of the shotgun scabbard strapped to her torso. Certain I was about to die, I screamed at her to go away, to leave me alone, and she screamed right back at me, asking me questions I didn't understand. Dogs had begun to bark at the commotion, and my next-door neighbor's porch light turned on. Please, just go away, I shrieked as I finally found my footing and raced to the phone. I grabbed it from its holder and started to type 911 as I decided whether or not I should risk running up to the neighbor's house. When I looked at the broken window, though, she was nowhere to be seen. The wailing had rescinded, growing fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear her at all. I stood there, dumbly, until the sound faded entirely, my hand shaking. She was gone. I was sure of it. Should I still call emergency services? After that moment, I heard another, fainter sound and recognized the staticky audio immediately as the transmission from Isaac's spy gear. I raced upstairs, still clutching the phone, and grabbed the speaker from the floor where I had dropped it. I pressed it against my ear, listening to the faint sound of a familiar voice. "I hope this was worth it, kid," it said, calmly and coldly. "I hope you and your friends can laugh about this." I heard a bang, and then I heard nothing at all. It took 2 weeks for the police to find her body. Her final resting place was deep in the woods, under a thick shroud of junipers not far from the banks of Cedar Creek. As her face was mutilated beyond recognition, her body was identified by the shotgun lying beside her. They say that, although she was covered in enough blood to entice every animal within a 3-mile radius, her corpse was untouched by the beasts. Even the insects seemed hesitant to feed, and the fungi slow to grow upon her body, as though even the lowliest creatures feared contamination by the lonely woman in the woods. They did not find a brooch on her person. I used to work with an independent towing company near St. Cloud, Minnesota. We mostly operated near Wilmar, Sauk Center, Tomskog, and Glenwood. I usually did roadside assistance and recovery. Out in these parts, you get a surprisingly large share of vehicles that are just abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I know it's a common sight to see rusted out wrecks by the side of the road, but if it wasn't for guys like me, you'd see 3 times as many. So, I got this call about a rust bucket that had smashed into a stop sign and been left by the roadside. I was called in for the pickup. It's not fun heading out in the dark as the rain clouds roll in, but that's even more reason to get it done. Accidents happen in the dark. Someone could get hurt. It took me a while to get out there. Not a lot of cars on the road. I turned on my warning lights and stepped out, keeping my earbuds in while listening to my work playlist. I was sort of conditionally training myself to only listen to country on the job and rock on my spare time, thinking I could Pavlov my way into some kind of work-life recognition thing. Once I got out of my truck, I could immediately tell something was off. I'd gone down that road before, and I'd never seen a stop sign anywhere near it. It was a straight road. Why would there be a stop sign? The car in question was this old Beetle. The paint had peeled off years ago, and half the interior was either rotten or torn out. There was algae halfway up the wheels, with tufts of grass sticking out of the suspension. This thing wouldn't run in 100 years. Hell, you could barely get it to roll at all. I was perplexed. There was no way someone was driving this or crashing into anything. Someone had dragged it up there for one reason or another. Turning my attention back to my truck, I almost choked on spit. I counted no less than 5 people by the roadside, staring up at the flashing warning lights. 5 people, all different ages. They had this strange look of absolute adoration on their faces, slack-jawed and unblinking. They didn't seem to mind my presence. They were just there for the lights. I looked at them for a moment. These were the people that had dragged the car up, no question about it. Hell, some of them had muddy hands and boots still. I thought about saying something, but figured I'd just get my phone out in case someone wanted to cause trouble. I locked my truck, not taking my eyes off these people, and tried to get on with my job. They didn't seem to mind. They just stood there, their eyes wide and black, staring at the flashing warning lights. It was so eerie. I walked around that car, constantly checking over my shoulder. I was waiting for one of them to burst into a sprint or scream. But nothing happened. They just stood there, not a sound or a word. Heavy breathing in unison. I thought about filming it, but honestly, I had to get out of there. I scooched the fallen sign off the road and prepped the wreck. Through all of it, I got this worried chill creeping up my spine whenever there was a sharp noise. A rattling chain might set them off, or a creak of metal. I didn't know what these people's deal was, so I didn't know how unpredictable they were. As I finished and got ready to move out, I threw a final glance back at them. My heart skipped a beat when one of their eyes, yes, a singular eye, turned to me. She was probably in her 40s, with the kind of face that just screamed exhaustion. As the second eye slowly settled on me, there was this bubbling unease in my stomach. Something about her was just inhumane. It didn't feel like meeting the eyes of a fellow Minnesotan, or even a Homo sapien. This woman was something else, something other. I was about to get back into my truck when she opened her mouth and spoke. "Look at me," she said. I did. I couldn't not do it. It felt like staring down a predator, keeping it at bay. I had to look at her. Of course, there was a plan to it. I didn't notice the two men sneaking up on me from the other side of the road. I have a hard time retelling this part. It's burned into my thoughts, but it's not like a good burn. It's like a scab, and I just hate poking at it. The only word that I can use for it is that it frightens me. Not just because of the violent implications, but because I now know firsthand just how frail I am as a person and living being. Hands grabbed me, and I was pushed up against the side of my truck. Some guy in his 50s and what looked like a girl in her late teens, both insanely strong, with the kind of grip you might expect in a wild animal. They were clinging to me like their life depended on it. And yet, none of them said anything. No noise, no words, just huffs and unblinking eyes. Even then, as my hands were pushed up against the cold metal, they weren't even looking at me. They were still looking up at the warning lights. The one who had spoken came around. She faced me and held something up. It looked like one of those old box cameras with a crank on the side. She turned it on with a metallic clunk, blinding me with a powerful and warm light. She slowly turned the crank on the side like a nightmarish jack-in-a-box. With every click, something would block the light for a split second, effectively making it flash. She turned it faster and faster. Blinking turned into a strobe light. I can't explain what I felt. It was like something filling my stomach, like my body was contracting into itself, trying to make me shrink. I became so hyper-focused on this one blinking light coming out of that awful black box. I didn't even notice that they let go of my hands, or how they all gathered around me, how they watched as I had this mental seizure. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. My mind was just filled with this clicking noise, resetting every impulse that came across my mind. I should run. Click. Who are these people? Click. I'm in danger. Click. I couldn't finish a single train of thought. I just stood there, as transfixed to that box as they'd been to my warning lights. I don't know when I passed out. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. All I know is that I woke up by the roadside hours later as a passerby tapped me on the shoulder. "You all right there?" they asked. "You hurt?" I shook my head, trying to adjust my eyes. They still burned from the light. "I don't know," I said. "I honestly don't know." I called my boss, telling them what had happened, explaining why I hadn't answered any calls. I also gave a statement to the police, explaining what little I could to a very understanding man. It didn't make sense to them, or me for that matter. Nothing was stolen, nothing was vandalized, just people attacking people for seemingly no reason. The officers seemed sorry to hear it, as if already apologizing for what they wouldn't be able to do. I didn't see them until much later, under very different circumstances. I was put on sick leave for a couple of days to get back on my feet, but at that point, I didn't even know what I was feeling anymore. Coming home, I couldn't concentrate. Everything just felt off. I could barely keep myself focused on the most minute task. I forgot my cooked rice on the stove. I put down my phone in the middle of a phone call. I left the tap running. I kept getting sidetracked, like there was something vital missing in the back of my mind. This continued on and off for a couple of days. I vividly remember how I tried to stream some stupid reality show, but I kept forgetting what I was watching. I didn't dare use my car or go shopping. I walked, and even then, I had to look down at my shopping list every few minutes. I remember this one time when I tried to take a shower. I left the water running, forgetting to turn it off, just like with everything else. As I finished up and stepped out, I flipped the light switch, but that switch is this really sensitive thing, and I accidentally clicked it twice, making the lights flash. That sent a wave of warmth through my body. The kind of relieving warmth you get from stepping out of a blizzard and into a living room. It was familiar and welcome, as if this was what I was supposed to feel like. In a simple way, it fixed me. For a moment, I felt like myself again. I ended up standing there for about 20 minutes, just flipping the switch on and off, on and off. I pressed it until the click of the switch started to sound like the click of the black box, until time started to slow, making every click seem further away, no matter how fast I went. And when I looked up at myself in the mirror, I could see that my eyes were completely black, as alien as those I'd seen that night. I could picture myself as her, exhausted, unblinking, and lost to the world. It scared the hell out of me. I shut my eyes and tried to keep them closed, but every moment away from the flashes, the clicking, it drained me. Like being stuck in the middle of nowhere as a blizzard slowly picks up, I could feel myself growing distant, colder, slower. I twisted and turned in my bed, trying to focus on something, anything. "Mississippi," I mumbled. "Spell Mississippi." I got all the way through it the first time. By the second time, I made it about halfway through. By the third, I could start but didn't really know what I was doing anymore. By the fourth, I was upset, and I didn't even know why. At some point in the night, I heard sirens. not too distant either. Something in me tickled. It wanted me to get up. The thought crossed my mind that maybe, on some level, I just wanted to see the flashing lights. I walked up to my bedroom window and put my hand on the blinders. I knew I shouldn't engage with it. I kept trying to fight myself. The only thoughts that meant no interruption were those aimed at the sole purpose of seeing those lights. I kept trying to convince myself to step away, but it wasn't that easy. Just a peek, I thought, to see if it works. There were 3 police cars and a fire truck, all with their lights on. I was mesmerized. I saw it in such great detail. It was as if time took a step back just to allow me to bask in the excitement. I could see every color shift, the intensity of moving back and forth between lights. It was like an exploding mini-cosmos, filling my head with warmth and excitement. I stared blankly at it from my bedroom window. It was absolutely gorgeous. They were only there for a moment, but that was all I needed. I was left breathless, my face burning hot and my eyes watery. It felt like I'd run a marathon. Hell, even my knees were weak. I had a short moment of clarity as the clouds in my mind parted. I had to keep the momentum up. I had to stay sane. Running to the kitchen, I got my flashlight and all the spare batteries I could find, spilling an entire drawer of miscellaneous bits and bobs onto the floor. I had to stop a few times to flick the light switch, a boost. By the end of the night, I found myself standing in the middle of a dark kitchen with my flashlight firmly planted under my face, clicking it on and off, on and off. I had to. I stopped sleeping after that. Sleep gave me nothing, but that constant flash kept me going. It allowed me to keep my head clear enough to make some sort of plan, to fight it. Not that I really wanted to, but because I knew in my heart of hearts that it wasn't normal. They'd done something terrible to me, but for the moment, I had to find a way to live with it. I dug out my Christmas lights and set them to blink intermittently. I taped it all up along the walls of my bedroom, right next to my computer. Staying reasonably lucid, I managed to search the web for whatever this could be, but I couldn't find a thing. I kept trying to spell Mississippi in my head, to sort of test whether I was thinking straight or not. More often than not, I could make it through, but even a short lapse of flashes would make me drop a few letters. But yeah, I didn't get very far in my searches. I've never heard of something like this happening to anyone, and neither did anyone else seemingly. Soon, I was just alt-tabbing between my dark desktop and a full-screen white page. On and off, on and off. I could tell I was getting weaker. The lack of sleep betrayed me. My hands were shaking from a lack of food. After a while, I realized I couldn't just have lights around me. I needed to indulge, to stare, drown in them. I was getting desperate. I wandered the streets, hoping to see or hear something that could give me that rush back. I even thought about starting a fire just to get a fire truck to come by. That's when it hit me. That's probably what those people had been doing all along. They set that rusted car up and lured me there, maybe solely for the flashing lights. It's hard to admit my low point. I was standing with my phone in my hand, about to call 911 to claim I was being attacked. Anything to get the flashing lights and sirens. There was that screaming voice inside of me demanding that I do it. And a whisper telling me I was destroying myself. I had a choice: go down this path and find myself a slave to impulses, or to surrender to the cloud in my head. I chose the latter. I tossed my phone and wandered off, slowly forgetting where I was going or what I was doing. I only vaguely remember the sky turning dark and rain. There was a car honking as they raced past me, and a worried driver asking me how I was doing. Without direction or purpose or solution, I just kept going, somewhere. It's a strange feeling, finding yourself lost in your own darkness. It feels like viewing your life through a keyhole, catching only bits and pieces with a barrier in between. And in the end, my efforts were useless. There were others there on my side of the keyhole, other people just as lost, wandering around. Some I remembered from that awful night, others weren't even human. It's not like I saw them, more that I sensed them. Then, it all came back to me. I was standing in a clearing in a forest, somewhere off in the middle of nowhere. There were others there, but I didn't care to look at them. All I could focus on was the middle-aged woman standing in front of me with a blinking black box and a crank that clicked. Out of all the lights I'd seen, this was the most beautiful. It was like getting sucked into a deeper understanding. The clicks grew further apart, and every moment was stretched. In that bliss, every blink of the light was like days passing by in the heaven of my own making. There was a benevolence there, someone caring for me, like a balm on my soul. Then it stopped. Back in the darkness, a woman held out a phone as the box stopped clicking. Ambulance. And that was all she needed to say. We made it to the parking lot out of the old mall. The old Deadeye for those of you who live around here. There were 6 of us, but none of us said a word. There was this young woman who'd gotten a hold of her phone, and she didn't seem to know what to do. She looked up, as if coming out of a daze. "Are we doing this?" she asked. "Are we really doing this?" There was a solemn moment when none of us knew what to do. Finally, there was an older man who stepped forward. He looked the young woman up and down and turned to the rest of us. No one said anything. What was there to say? He considered it, then leaned back, putting all his weight behind it. He proceeded to strike her across the eye. She dropped to the ground. The phone rolled out of her hands. The others proceeded to beat her within an inch of her life. It was absolutely relentless. It's like she stopped being human to them. I called the emergency services. Hell, I told them exactly what I was seeing. A group of people brutally beating someone. Meanwhile, the others kept attacking her. None of them looked away or even frowned. I saw blood spatter hit one of their faces, and they didn't even blink. Maybe they wanted to be convincing, or maybe there was no space for a second guesser. Either way, we would have fulfilled our duty. She was barely breathing when they stepped away. The man who initiated the beating held out a hand towards me, demanding the phone back. I handed it to him. I was too new to be entrusted with something of that value. I wanted to speak, but I didn't. Looking down at the broken body, gasping for air, it did something to me. It put a suggestion in my head that maybe this wasn't okay. It made me question myself and made me think. I remember standing there, watching the blood pooling, when I considered, can I spell Mississippi? I couldn't. Despite following this path and succumbing to it all, it was still taking something from me. That was more apparent than ever. It was this subtle reminder that, yes, I was going down the wrong path. I was doing something wrong. I wasn't fixing myself this way. There were sirens in the distance. I could see the top of the tree line changing colour. They were coming. The others hid by the side of the road, their eyes going dark with anticipation. I joined them, hesitantly, trying to make up some sort of plan. When the flashing lights came around the bend, it was like drinking a glass of ice water on a hot summer's day. It was a soothing breeze. Nothing like what I'd experienced from that black box, but a substitute. A damn decent one at that. The colours bathed us, and we just soaked it all in. Except now, I had this feeling that it just wasn't right. Like I was being used and manipulated. Like there was something in those flashing lights looking back at me. "Ayo," someone whispered. "Ayo." The others joined, a choir of hushed voices. At first, it was just a noise, but I could see what they were getting at. It was a fitting name, the thing that drew us in, giving us a peek at something else. Ayo, the end of, the see you, Ayo. There was an ambulance and 2 patrol cars. By the time they got to the beaten woman, we were all stepping out of the woods together. Someone was yelling at us to stop. There were threats, demands, pistols drawn. Then a click. Looking to my left, the woman with the black box had returned. A first flashing light in their direction was all it took to distract them. I couldn't see it properly from my angle. The others flocked to it like moths, but I hadn't fallen under its spell yet. Instead, I looked to the broken woman. She was barely conscious. The paramedics didn't have the time to take her away. One of them was hiding in the back of the ambulance, while the other just stood there, staring at the woman with the black box. We all moved forward, slowly. A few whispers, a declaration of faith. No, not faith. Just worship. It isn't faith when you've seen it, when you know it's there. The others joined into a circle. 2 police officers as well. All of them stared blindly into this captivating light, this invitation to behold, to step outside yourself and see this hidden blessing. I tried to look away. I tried so hard. I tried holding my eyes shut, but I couldn't. I wanted to look deeper and disappear into that light, to let it burn me hollow, inside and out, to be free. Home. I heard it calling. I can't describe it, but I heard it. Even with 2 hands covering my eyes, the clicking noise from that box bore its way into my head and forced an electrical impulse of light inside my eyelids. No matter, I thought, maybe it would be wonderful in the end. Looking back at it, it's so unreal. The thoughts are still there, but it's like they're not even my own. Like trying to recap a movie you saw 20 years ago, and you know, hadn't it been for one stupid thing, I would never have made it here. One of the officers, the one who drew a pistol, had dropped it. I slipped on it when I was drawn in. I fell hard, torso first, knocking the air out of my lungs. There, lying on the side, I noticed I was lying parallel to the beaten woman. Looking at one another from across the parking lot, I was reminded that there was still time. Looking at her, I didn't see Eo. I just saw the pain of what was to come if I didn't tear myself away. So I did. In one quick swoop, I picked up the gun at my feet, held it up, pointed forward and looked. I pulled the trigger. The moment I did, my eyes fell upon the black box. I could see it before me, every flash of light from that box stretching into days, weeks. I could see the bullet travel across the sky in my mind, like a celestial body traveling across the stars. I could drown my thoughts in this world of AO, eternally seen and loved, wanted, needed. I gave up completely, just like the others. I did. It scares the hell out of me to admit, but experiencing that thing for the third time was the final snap. Luckily, that one bullet found its target. The box shattered into pieces. The inside of it was nothing but a powerful bulb and a little hand-cranked fan. That was all there was to it. As the pieces spread across the asphalt, there was a moment of realization, like something was torn out of my head. The world started to spin, as if passing by 1,000,000 miles per hour. I got the worst case of vertigo I'd ever experienced, barely able to breathe from the nausea. Others collapsed to the ground, expunging their empty stomachs. I saw someone having a seizure. The man who'd beaten that girl half to death crawled up to me, took my handgun, and fired every single round into the woman who held that black box. Maybe he too saw his chance to be free. It was absolute chaos. I was sick, I was accused, more flashing lights, but all they did was worsen my nausea. I got my blood pressure checked. I had to spend a night in jail, I think. I could barely think straight. Most of my time was passed leaning over a toilet bowl, emptying my bowels over and over. Some of the stuff that came out just didn't make any sense. When the hell did I eat a sunflower? And why the hell was it blue? The beaten woman didn't accuse me. If anything, she cleared me. Maybe she saw that last-ditch effort for what it was. The man who shot down our captor was charged, but I don't know for what. After many considerations, I was eventually cleared. One of the officers on site was actually the one I'd initially talked to when I was first assaulted, so maybe he felt bad about not listening the first time. Maybe you've seen the articles. They called it a prank gone wrong. I think it reached like page 8 of a national paper. This was a couple of years ago. I wanted to put this to paper to remind myself that it actually happened, and that my feelings and fears are still valid. Because, to this day, I get this sort of Pavlovian response whenever something flashes. It's like my body goes into shock, immediately trying to get something out of me. Hell, it made me throw up once when I was photographed for work. I think the box was something called a Raskin. I've seen a few of them circling online. Some sort of replica of an art piece by some old turn-of-the-century author. I just wanted to put this out there. When I found myself looking for answers and there was none to be found, I felt so goddamn alone. At least now, there is one of us talking about it. It stares in at me, pale fingers pressed against the window's glass. It's raining hard now, and with the light from inside hitting it, I can see that the water running down from its white skin has a milky cast to it that the rain above doesn't seem to have. Looking back to its face, I see it smiling at me now. Rows of grey peg teeth. Too many teeth. And behind them, a grey tongue twists in that greater dark as it tries to speak or laugh without sound. I have the odd thought that it's eaten too much candy and gone rotten inside, and it's no wonder. For all its strangeness, the thing outside looks like a little girl. At least, until you get to its eyes. They are black and cold and pitiless, and though it's probably my terrified mind playing tricks, I could swear there was something moving behind those eyes. Worms. And that they are what is really looking at me and wanting to get in. Across the house, I hear Alison start to scream. My stomach lurched when my phone lit up and I saw it was Alison. I didn't want to fight anymore, and I didn't think talking about it again would help anything. I told her I wanted to break up 2 weeks earlier, and while that initial conversation had been sad and hard, I thought at the time that it resolved things. I'd even hoped in time we could be friends again. But the next day she called and wanted to talk again for hours, and the day after that, and on and on. The conversation never changed. I felt like we needed to move on and find people that we'd be more compatible with long term, and she wanted us to stay together. The longer I resisted giving in, the angrier and more bitter she got. By the end of the week, she was accusing me of cheating on her, of lying to her, of using her. I told her none of that was true, and I tried to stay patient because I knew she was hurting and not herself. But eventually, I had enough. I told her last week that I didn't think we should talk anymore for a while, and I hadn't answered her daily texts and calls since then. And that was my initial impulse this time too. But she kept calling. Normally, it was only one call or text, and she was done for at least a few hours. But when she called the 4th time in a row, I got worried something was really wrong. Taking a deep breath, I answered the phone. "Travis, are you there?" Yeah, I'm here. Is everything okay? You've been blowing up my phone." "Yeah, no, everything isn't okay. I did something stupid. I didn't really mean to. I'm not trying to excuse it, but I didn't really think it would work, and then I went to take it back and..." "Ali, what are you talking about?" "I'm coming over. Just don't open the door for anyone. Keep the doors locked, and please don't open the door until I get there. Look, I'm really tired and I don't..." "Travis, I need you to listen to me. This isn't about us. If you don't listen to me, I'm worried you might die tonight." And then she was gone. I stared at the phone for a long time, my mind racing as I went back through everything she'd said and tried to make sense of it. What was she talking about? Was she crazy or on drugs? Was she dangerous? It hadn't sounded like she was threatening me exactly, but people got weird sometimes when they were upset or hurting. Still, not that Alison didn't have issues, but I didn't think she tried to hurt me. I jumped when I heard the thump at the back door. My first thought was that it was Alison, though I didn't know why she'd be going around back. Walking through the house, I turned on a couple of more lights, her frantic warnings echoing in my head. She'd sounded really scared, but all the doors were locked, weren't they? That's when I heard the knob on the back door start to turn. Heart hammering, I turned the corner and leapt to the door, slamming against it as I turned the deadbolt and then twisted the knob lock as well. What the hell was... I moved off the door and over to the window, looking out the back porch. It had started raining outside, and it was late enough that it was fully dark, so I couldn't make out anything but a small dark shape leaning against the outside of the door. It looked like a short adult or a child, their ear pressed against the door, as though listening for me on the other side. What the hell? It lifted its head away from the door as it caught sight of me. A moment later, it was framed by the window and the interior light, pale and terrible, and smiling as it mouthed something silent to me with its pale lips and dark tongue. Looking into its black eyes, I started to back away. But that's when I heard Allison. Screams and pounding from the front door. It sounded like she was trying to break down the door. And maybe she was. Running back to the front of the house, I started to make out some of what she was yelling. "Let me in, now, it's coming." I took the time to look through the peek hole in the door before opening it. It was Allison, looking wet and crazy and terrified. Under other circumstances, that might have given me pause, but at the moment, I didn't feel much different. I threw open the door and she jumped in, ripping the door out of my grasp and slamming it shut behind her before turning the locks again. One of them followed me. Oh God, have you seen the other one yet?" I stared at her. "Other one? What, there's two of them?" Her eyes widened slightly. "It's already here too, isn't it? Damn it, damn it, damn it." She yelped and recoiled from the door as the knob began to rattle. She looked at the door and back to me. "Do you have any guns?" Frowning, I shook my head. "You know I don't. Look, what is this all about? If this is some kind of prank, it's a really bad thing to..." Grabbing the side of my face, she started crying softly. "It's no prank. I thought it was nonsense. She trailed off as she looked around the room. "Where did you see the other one?" I swallowed. "She's at the back door." Nodding, she took my hand and pulled me further into the house. "We need to go somewhere without windows. Your office. That door locks." Pulling my hand free, I stopped in the hallway. "Wait, stop. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what the hell is going on." Grimacing, she grabbed my arm. "There's no time for that. We need to barricade a room until we can get help." I shook my head. "Screw that. If this is so serious, I'll call 911 right now." I pulled out my phone and held it up. "You sure you want me to do that?" She pulled out her own phone. "Sure, go ahead. If I can't get you to listen, let's at least get the cops in the way." "I don't have signal. I always have signal here." I looked back at my own phone. It was the same. And while I went ahead and tried calling twice, there was no dial tone or ringing. Looking up, I met Allison's worried eyes. "Damn, fine. Let's go in there, and you explain to me what the hell this is." And after we were in my office, and the door was locked and barricaded with a bookshelf, that's exactly what she did. I haven't been dealing with this whole breakup thing well. I mean, damn, you know that, right? And I know I've seemed crazy, and then I started accusing you of stuff and... Sitting down in my desk chair, I snorted. "Yeah, like cheating, which I never did." She grimaced and nodded. "I believe you. In my head I do, but the last few days have been really hard, and I've been really sad and bitter. I'd normally talk about stuff like this with, well, you, but since that wasn't working, and you had enough of my crazy, which I totally get, but just saying, I went online and started reading different forums and stuff where people were mad at exes, got cheated on, wanted revenge, all kinds of stuff. It felt like it was helping, just seeing other people in that kind of pain, you know." Allison slumped down against the wall. "I never posted anywhere, never gave anyone anything, but somehow I get this email a few days ago. No pictures or links, not selling anything that I could tell. Just a few paragraphs describing, well, it called it a revenge ritual." I stared at her. "A ritual?" "The email called it the Night Hunt. I know how it sounds. At first I thought it was just an odd story or some viral marketing thing, but nothing else like that came. and I couldn't even see the address it came from. And it, well, it stuck with me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I kept opening my phone and rereading it, and it didn't sound hard to do, and I didn't expect it to do anything really. Of course I didn't. I thought it was more like a cathartic thing, like when people burn someone's stuff after they break up. She looked back up, her expression haunted. I didn't know what I did was real. I felt my stomach twisting at the fear and dread in her voice. What did you do? She buried her face in her arms. It said to take a box. You tie it up with a bow, but before you close it, you put in something from yourself and the one that wronged you. That and some paper. And then you then take it to as close as possible to the place where you were wronged and bury it. It has to be done at sunrise. That next night, the person that wronged you, they get punished. I felt my pulse rising higher. Punished? How? Alison shook her head without looking up. I don't know. It was all nonsense, right? I didn't think it was going to work. So, what? You hired someone to punish me? She did look up then. No, you're not listening. I didn't really want to hurt you, okay? I was just mad and sad about everything. Yes, I got the box and did the thing. I went and buried it. Well, you told me we were done being together. But after that, I worried about it. I kept worrying about it all day, so after work today, I drove back out there to dig it back up. I felt dumb, but I felt guilty too. She let out a bitter laugh. But then the rain came. You know how people drive in the rain. There was an accident and I was stuck in traffic for over an hour. And by the time I got out there, it was almost dark. I ran out to get it. I was feeling more scared about it now, though I didn't know why. That's when I saw them. I leaned forward. Who? She gave me a hollow smile. Those children. A small boy and girl, dressed in dark clothes and with super pale skin. They were digging up the box. Dropping her eyes, she went on. I wanted to approach them, but just looking at them, even from a distance in the dark, I was terrified. You could tell there was something wrong with them. Not just how they looked or moved, but something more. It was like radiation coming from them, how wrong they were. So I hid, and I watched. They opened the box, took out the note and the two things. A necklace you gave me for my birthday a couple of years ago, and a hat of yours you always wear around the yard at my place. The boy kept the necklace and gave her the hat. The next moment, she was gone. Just kind of a weird shadowy blur, like the film got sped up in one spot. And the boy? He turned and looked at me. She paused for a moment, looking around. Do you hear something? I hear banging, far away. Or maybe it's my imagination. I strained to listen for a moment, but all I heard was the wind and the rain lashing the roof overhead. No, I don't think so. But so, what happened with the boy? She shuddered. He just started walking towards me, like Pepe Le Pew or something. I don't know. I just knew I needed to get out of there, and I needed to warn you. Letting out a long breath, I looked down at my phone again. Still no signal. So what? Who are they? Alison shrugged. I don't know. They aren't people. I don't know what they are, just that she's after you. And he's chased me all the way here. Standing up, I felt fear and anger bubbling up, but I tried to keep my voice even. Well, what did the damn email say about them? Just pretty much what I said. It was more flowery and all, but it was basically just, this is a ritual to screw someone over who screwed with you, to rebalance things. It said that, I think. I shook my head. And you just do this, not knowing what it's going to do or how it might hurt me, or you even? She scowled at me. I said I messed up. I said I didn't know it would really work. Why would I think it was real? Some magic nonsense? But as soon as I did it, I knew something wasn't right. When I saw them... Her expression broke and she started tearing up again. God, I really am so sorry. I didn't know. I'll figure out a way to fix this. I was torn between wanting to comfort her and yell at her. How in the hell would you... Damn. I sighed and looked at the ceiling. What was this note? You said something about a paper you put in there. What was that? Alison sat up more. Yeah, it was just like a line of French. I copied it from the email, but I didn't know what it means. I stared at her. Jeez, just writing stuff down and putting it in this damn thing, and you can't be bothered to Google it? Her expression began to turn red. Stupid, I know, but it was just a few words, and I didn't want to know. I was... She shook her head again. I was afraid if I knew too much, then I wouldn't go through with it, and I thought I needed it. Ice crept across my chest. Because you, at least a part of you, you thought it might be real, didn't you? She was crying more freely now. Yeah, okay, maybe I did. I'm ashamed of it, and I'd take it back now if I could, but yeah, losing you made me hate myself, and that made it feel okay to hate you too. Somehow, even in the middle of everything going on, that managed to hurt me more than I'd expected. Turning to stare at the wall, I asked again, do you remember what the note said? Like, what the letters or words were? I think so. It was like, oh la tree or un la tree, maybe. Like that, but a little longer. I searched my memory from a year of college French. Suddenly, my mouth went dry. Was it un lut? I heard her sucking a breath. Yeah, that sounds like it. What's it mean? Resting my head against the wall, I didn't try to hide the fear in my voice anymore. It means one or the other. I jerked back as I felt a dull thud in the wall. Did you hear something again just now? She nodded. Yeah, me too. I think it's in the access door under the house. It comes open in the wind sometimes. Alison frowned at me. Well, even if they go under there, there's no doors into the house, right? And they don't seem to be coming in on us yet. I don't know if that's a rule of theirs, like vampires or something. I looked around the room. No doors, but there's a ductwork under there, and every room has vents. My eyes landed on the vent in the corner of the room, just as Alison began to scream. There were tiny, pale fingers poking out of the vent holes, stealthily pushing the cover free so the path inside with us would be open. I ran over and stomped on the vent cover with disgust, trying to crush the fingers between the lines of the metal. But they were already gone. Hearing another cry from Alison, I turned to see another vent in the far corner pushing up slowly. Get it, we have to keep them out. She did stand up then, and at first I thought she was moving to block the vent, but instead she went to the bookcase and yanked it aside enough to open the door partially. What are you doing? Stop that." She turned and looked back at me, even as she slid through the gap. "One or the other, and it's not going to be you." I ran across to stop her, but she was already gone down the hall, and by the time I opened the gap enough to get through, she'd made it to the front door and yanked it open. The storm came rushing in, wind and water and darkness, and for a moment I was terrified she was just going to leave the door open and let them both in. But no. She thumbed the knob lock and went out, slamming the door behind her. I ran to the window and looked out, watching in mute horror as she walked out into the rain. "Take me! It's my fault! Take me!" And then she was gone. It had been like she said, a dark blur. Like a patch of the night went fast and then slow again. One moment she was shaking in terror, calling out into the dark, trying to fix what she'd done. And the next she just wasn't. Less than a minute later, the rain stopped. That was a month ago. There's been no sign of Alison since, and though I did report her missing after discovering a car outside my house, I haven't told anyone about what really happened. They probably wonder if I did something to her, but they'll never find any sign of that or anything else. Because there's none to find. Well, that's not entirely true. Because on that back window where the thing that looked like a girl stared in at me, there is a permanent stain of ghostly white where a hand was pressed and dripped down. Seeing it now, instead of running down, it looks like it's grown up. A warped, pale fungus or a twisted, evil tree, grown up from the ground of the park where me and Alison first kissed, and where I told her we needed to end. Or maybe from the dark earth nestled in the shadowed corners of the human heart. I thought about calling the police, but I haven't figured out if I'm losing my mind or if my entire family has lost theirs. Maybe I'll wake up soon, and this will all have been a terrible nightmare. For context, I'm an only child and the only grandchild of my last living grandmother. A couple weeks ago, while at work, I received a phone call from my mother informing me that my grandmother had taken a fall in a kitchen. Mom said that my Uncle Lou was with her, and already in the ambulance. Paramedics suspected she had a fractured hip and somehow sliced open her foot. She was sedated due to the pain, but was otherwise responsive and fine. I immediately asked if I should meet them at the hospital, but Mom said, No, don't leave work. I'll update you once I know more." So, I waited. I love my grandmother, but she's probably the most stubborn woman I've ever met. She has a home remedy for just about anything and loathes seeing doctors. So I'm sure she won't be fun to deal with or confined to a hospital bed. It doesn't help that Grandma absolutely refuses to use a walker or cane despite her debilitating age, and will not leave her house to live in a nursing home. 6 months ago, Uncle Lou moved in with her to help out. Not that he said it out loud, but I've always suspected that he did it more for the free rent. With nothing else to do, I sat at work, distracted, and waited for a phone call from Mum with news. That call didn't come through until long after I'd gotten home and was brushing my teeth for bed. Apparently, Grandma was awake now and doing fine. She would need surgery for the broken hip, but they were able to get the laceration on her foot stitched up and bandaged. I asked to speak with her, so Mom held the phone up to Grandma's ear, and I told her I loved her and would come see her once she was discharged. The hospital only allowed 2 visitors, and Mom and Lou refused to leave her side. "Hi, honey," Grandma said through the receiver. "I'm okay, but they won't let me leave." My mom's voice in the background exasperatedly explained that she needs surgery. "So they tell me," she huffed. "I'm fine, Anna. Come see me when I'm home, and we can play cards." I smiled, promised to visit, and said goodbye. She was discharged the following week and sent home. The hip replacement was successful, but she developed a nasty infection on her foot. Between the 2 ailments, Grandma was confined to a bed. Once she was comfortable at home, Mom gave me the okay to come over, so I made some chicken dumpling soup and sat on the chair beside her while Mom spoon-fed it into Grandma's mouth. "There you go, Mom," my mother encouraged as Grandma sipped the broth off the spoon. I could tell Grandma was wildly out of it. I'd been expecting an earful about having to use a bedpan, but due to the cocktail of narcotics and antibiotics, she merely grumbled in annoyance at Mom's and Lou's constant hovering. For what it was, she seemed in good spirits, if not exceptionally tired. After about 2 hours and 2 small soup mishaps, I got up to leave. Mom saw me to the door. "She'll be fine, Anna," Mom reassured. "Lou and I are taking care of everything. Don't worry." I left feeling optimistic that my grandmother would be back to her Spitfire self relatively soon. That visit with the soup was over 2 weeks ago now. Not long after, Mom took a leave of absence at work and holed up in Grandma's house with Uncle Lou. Each time I called, Mom gave a new excuse as to why I shouldn't visit. Risk of infection, flu season, fatigue, bowel issues, you name it. At first, I accepted these excuses at face value. They seemed legit. But I can't even get Mom to put Grandma on the phone anymore. I made more soup yesterday and dropped it off, but Uncle Lou met me at the door and said it wasn't a good time, but he'd make sure she got it. "And we'll always let her know when you call," he assured. I noticed there was an intense floral yet antiseptic scent coming from the doorway. "Your mom won't stop cleaning," he explained. Frustrated, I called and complained to my father on my way home, but he defended Mom like always. "She's always been like this," he reminded me. "They're extremely close, your mom and Grandma. And Lou? Well, this just seems like classic Lou. You know, this is the first time they really had to face the reality of their mother's age. They're just protective and scared to lose her." I figured he was right, and I hung up the phone, feeling a little less unsettled. On Grandma's 89th birthday, however, I decided I wasn't going to take no for an answer. I would go over there and give her the present I purchased for her, a new thriller by a favourite author. I arrived at the house in late afternoon and noticed all the blinds were closed. Being that it was a warm spring day, it was common for Grandma to have all the windows open and drapes open, letting in both the sunlight and fresh air. I knocked twice on the front door, but no one came. I knocked again. No answer. I tried the knob, but the door was locked. I paused for a moment, considering that maybe no one was home. Maybe Grandma had a follow-up with a surgeon, but both cars were in the driveway. So I knocked again, louder. The door opened a crack, and a foul odor filtered out, nearly choking me. "Mom!" I exclaimed, when a face appeared on the other side of the door. "What is that smell?" Seeing it was only me, she opened the door another inch. "The infection's gotten worse, but we're monitoring it. Should I call an ambulance?" I asked in a panic, pulling my cell phone from my pocket. No, Anna," she quickly reassured me. "We have it handled. I stopped by and picked up refills of her antibiotics earlier, and we've been on the phone to a surgeon." Relieved, I took a deep breath, but the smell was so overpowering. "Mom, that smell is ungodly. Why don't you open the windows?" "We tried," she said, "but she got so cold." Mom shrugged and didn't move. "Can I come in?" I asked, attempting to look over her shoulder into the dim house. I really didn't want to go inside due to the smell, but if Grandma wasn't doing well, I wanted to see her. "I don't think it's a good idea," she murmured. "Where's Uncle Lou?" I asked. "Upstairs, in his room." Her voice was reassuring, but the smell turned my insides. Surely a smell like that could only mean bad things. I pushed the door open and Mum protested. "Just come back another day when she's feeling better. I promise you that Lou and I have this under control." In the kitchen, the odor was strong, but mixed with the smell of bleach. I couldn't tell if that made it better or worse. "At least let me see her and give her a birthday present." Mom looked down to see the wrapped gift in my hands and sighed. "Of course," she said. "Gosh, I'm sorry. We've just been so preoccupied. I'm sure she'll love it." At that moment, Uncle Lou came trotting down the stairs and smiled at me. "Anna, Mom will be so happy you're here." I looked at my mother incredulously. She was staring at her feet now. What was going on? Uncle Lou continued down the hall, and I could hear him as he opened the door to Grandma's bedroom. "Mom, you have a visitor for your birthday." The smell of the house was searing my nostrils, but I wasn't going to let Grandma know I was repulsed by it. Mom led me down the hall to Grandma's bedroom, instructing me along the way to put on a brave face. I blasted a smile across my face as I turned the corner into the room. Grandma was sitting up in bed, and Uncle Lou had taken a seat on the mattress beside her. His body obscured most of the view, but I could see her feet where they stuck out from under the quilt. The toes on her right foot were black with crumbling toenails and festering sores. The sheets under her heel stained yellow from dried pus. Lou was prattling on to her, but Grandma didn't respond. "Isn't it nice for Anna to come see you on your birthday, Mom? Goodness knows you've been through a lot this month. She has a present for you." He turned expectantly to me, his profile moving just enough to reveal Grandma's form where she sat up against the pillows. Grandma's dull, lifeless eyes stared straight ahead at the wall, unblinking and glazed over. Her eyes were crusty, and her jaw hung wildly agape with sagging lips, revealing a grey fuzz that had begun to coat her tongue. Uncle Lou patted her leg while Mom hastily pulled the quilt back down over her feet. I barely heard as Lou explained how cold she's been from the infection. He picked up a tissue from the box on the nightstand and began dabbing at the corner of her mouth. "She doesn't talk much due to the heavy sedation she's under," he explained. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the pallid, grey skin of Grandma's face and how it was starting to sag in ways that had nothing to do with her age. Flies buzzed overhead, and Mom picked up a fly swatter and began swatting wildly at them. "Goddamn flies," she mumbled. "They won't leave her alone." One of the flies circled Grandma's face and landed in her open maw. Uncle Lou merely shooed it away. "She's been sleeping sitting up like this for the past week or so," Mum explained, patting Grandma's now covered feet. "The pain is just too much for her to lay down. We tried, but her muscles spasm and she can't move." My knees were shaking, and I could all but back out of the room, reaching and pressing myself against the opposite wall, vomit creeping up the back of my throat. "It's okay, Anna," Uncle Lou said from inside the room. "I know it's hard to see her in such a state, but that's why your mum and I are here to take care of her. We agreed we wouldn't let her go back to that hospital. They've already messed up so much of her care. You saw her foot and what the doctors did to it. How a hospital could let gangrene go unnoticed is beyond me," Mum agreed. "We've been sponge bathing her regularly, airing her feet and changing the bandages frequently. It seems to be helping, right, Mum?" she asked, squeezing Grandma's ankle. I tried to put my head between my knees, but the smell was so overpowering. Mum stepped out in the hallway and touched my shoulder. I recoiled. "Oh, Anna, I am sorry. This is why I didn't want you to come over. The gangrene smell is hard to tolerate, and I didn't want you to have to see it like this." Not knowing what else to do, I pulled her into the kitchen and said in my most steady voice, "Mom, why didn't you tell me Grandma has passed?" Mum's face didn't change. She just looked at me. "What are you talking about, Anna? She's right there. You saw her." "Yeah, I did see her," I agreed, pointing at the bedroom down the hall where the smell was so strong that I was close to passing out. "But Grandma is dead, Mum. You know that, right? She's very obviously passed away." Mum's eyebrows narrowed as she pursed her lips. "Listen, Anna, I get that this is hard for you. Hell, it's hard for all of us. But if you're saying this just to hurt me, it's not going to work. Stop being a brat. Your father is on the way over with a birthday cake." The room began to spin, and I needed to get out of that house immediately. I tossed the present on the kitchen table and grabbed my bag, fleeing out of the kitchen door and into my car, where I took deep gulps of fresh air. I could see my mom at the large bay window, looking out at me. She looked angry and upset, but quickly turned and walked away. I pounded the steering wheel, yelling obscenities. Other than an open casket funeral, I had never seen a dead body before, let alone one that had clearly been dead for weeks. But Grandma was undoubtedly dead, and my mother and uncle were staying in that house with a corpse, washing it, feeding it, and talking to it like nothing had changed. I threw open the car door and vomited all over Grandma's neglected shrubs. By the time the dry heaves kicked in, Dad's car pulled in the driveway. "Hey, sweetheart," he said as he opened his car door, seeing me kneeling in the grass. "Are you alright? Your mom called and told me you were quite upset." "Dad, she's dead," I choked out, pointing at the house. "Who's dead?" he asked, his voice worried. "Grandma," I shouted. "Grandma is dead. Mom and Lou, they're just sitting in there with her body." "Anna, calm down. Your mum mentioned you were in hysterics and talking nonsense." "Talking nonsense? What are you saying?" I choked out. "Go look, Dad. I swear, you'll see. She's dead, and Mom and Lou have lost their minds." "All right," he said, holding up his arms in surrender. "Let me grab the cake and I'll go inside and see what's going on. Just stay here, okay?" I collapsed back in the front seat of my car, blasting the AC in an attempt to flush the smell of rotten flesh out of my nose. It felt like an hour before the front door opened again, and Dad calmly walked over to my driver's side window. "Hi, Annabelle," he said cautiously. "Did you see her, Dad? You saw her, right?" "Shh, Anna," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Calm down. Yes, I saw her, and she's very sick, but otherwise alive. Your mum and Lou are taking good care of her." "What?" I nearly screamed. "Come inside," Dad said, going for the door handle. I quickly locked the car. Dad threw up his hands in frustration. "Just come inside, Anna. Uncle Lou is getting Grandma into a wheelchair, and we're going to have some cake." He glanced at the front window of the house. "Ah, see? There she is." I glanced up to see my grandmother's face at the window, her dead eyes looking blankly out over the front yard. Rigor mortis had made it so her body couldn't sit in the wheelchair just right. Even from a distance and through a pane of glass, I could see death in her eyes and the shocking gape of her mouth. Her face looked even more twisted now, as if she'd taken a last breath in a tremendous amount of pain. But what made me scream in abject terror was that her cloudy pupils seemed to turn ever so slightly toward me. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the driveway, ignoring the shouts of my father and Uncle Lou bursting out the front door. I didn't dare go home, where I was sure my father would follow. Were they right? Was she actually alive? It's not like I checked for a pulse or air in her lungs before I took off. I didn't touch her at all. Could it be me then? Was I the one having a nervous breakdown? I don't know what to do now. I'm absolutely terrified. Worst of all, when I close my eyes, all I see is my grandmother's rotting face.